Good morning. Today is Wednesday, August 25th, our second day of class. We are going to continue our introduction to the class by talking about our first major physiological process, and that is homeostasis. And then we're going to start building that foundation we've talked about of that hierarchy, starting at the bottom of the ladder with chemistry. If there's time, we'll talk a little bit about histology. At the end of class today, we'll see how the class goes. Handful of stuff going on next week. Your Unit 1 lab manual review is due. Remember, it has two parts to it: a check your recall and your check your understanding, and that is pages 29 through 36. Your Mastering A&P introduction is due, so if you haven't access to your Mastering A&P, make sure you do that. Your first Labster lab simulator is due. We were talking about this before class started today. I remember for full credit, you needed 100% complete and 80% correct. If you do not get it 80% correct the first time you go through it, you can complete that as many times as it takes to improve your grades. So you're welcome to do that. Again, the point of it is to be a learning process. And then while most of you have already done your student info sheets, those who haven't, they're due on Monday as well. Wednesday next week, your lab manual Unit 3. Now, Unit 3 is on the microscopes. Even though we are not doing microscopes, obviously you're not going to physically hold a microscope unless you happen to have one at home, in which case you're a little weird. But if you have a microscope at home, even if you don't, we're still responsible for how they work. Histology is a huge part of this class, and that's what Unit 3 is about. My guess is because it's about microscopes, they've done that section a little bit differently. What they have is they have all of the activities that we would normally be doing in the classroom to learn how the microscope works. And then the review questions are at the top. So literally every other section of the lab manual has the unit review at the end of the section. But for some reason in Unit 3 for the microscopes, it is included at the top of all of those pages. So don't worry about doing the activities underneath. You need to understand what's going on. You need to know the parts of a microscope and how a microscope works. But what you're responsible for turning in is the review questions that are at the top of the page. And when you look at it, it'll make sense. Your mitosis labster is due, and because we are rapidly approaching our first exam already, on Wednesday the 1st, we will also have a practice lab exam in class. So it'll give you a chance to see what a lab exam is going to be like, and also be able to gauge how you're studying for the exam so far. Yes, Augustina, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just a little confused. What's the difference between the lab manual and then the labster? Or is it both the same thing?
The lab manual is this. It's it's basically like a big workbook. Some people have purchased it online. I know there was some chat in the beginning. It can be purchased as part of a bundle from Foliate through the bookstore. Mine is bound because it's the instructor version, but the student is actually loose leaf, makes it easier, more manageable to work with. Labster is a lab simulator program that you're going to access through actually, we didn't do that in the introduction. Let's go ahead and do that.
Okay.
So when you go, into your modules, no, it's not through Pearson. The PhysioX is through Pearson. The Labster is not. So when you go here to the lab simulator, so for instance, you'll click on the Labster, homeostatic control. That's the first one we need to work on. It has an explanation of what the project is going to be. And then when you click this, it opens it up in a new window. It loads the program, and it is basically a lab simulator that you are going to go through and complete the activity. This is embedded through Canvas. So once you complete the activity, the grade is automatically input. What we looked at on Monday was PhysioX. That is the one that is through Pearson, and that is the other lab simulator that we're going to be working with as well. So as you can say, it takes this one a little bit of time to load and everything else. But yes, you're going to come and do this activity. And the nice thing is you can do this activity as many times as you like. Amanda, did you have a question about this or something else?
About this, I was just going to make a note that you have to be using Chrome or Firefox.
Correct.
It will not work without it. And you have to basically use your laptop. I've tried to use it on my iPad and other systems and it does not work. So just so everyone knows.
Well, and again, to take quizzes, to take the exams, you're going to be in Chrome anyway. So Chrome is usually the best for Canvas for this type of stuff. Canvas is Chrome is usually the best one to use anyway. All right. Did I answer your question, Augustina, or do you have another one?
So I just had one more. So when you're talking about the review questions, that's on the actual lab manual?
Yes.
Okay, so then those, we would answer those every time it's due, but that's not always due, or it is?
I mean, at most of the unit reviews, I mean, I think for, let's see, for 430, because we're going to use this lab manual for both 430 and 431, it looks like we are going to do every unit through 14. So yes, all the unit reviews 1 through 14, with the exception of unit 2. We're not doing unit 2, but every other unit between 1 and 14, we are going to be you will be turning in those reviews for grades. Absolutely.
Okay, and is that one also the same where it has to be 100% complete and 80% correct, or no?
No, that's the lab simulator. Remember, for most of the homeworks you're going to be turning in, including the unit reviews, I'm looking for time and effort. So so there will be some homework assignments that will be graded for correctness, where if you get something wrong, you will lose points on it. But I see most homeworks, especially these workbook homework assignments in the lab manuals, as directed studying. I'm telling you the things that you should be studying to be successful in this class. And studying should be a learning process. So I'm not going to penalize you for getting something wrong, but I will penalize you if you're not putting time and effort into it. So if you put a 2-word answer for, one of these essay questions, or if you leave an answer blank, then you're clearly not putting time and effort into it, and you will lose points for that. If you write a beautiful paragraph and it is 100% incorrect, the fact that you still put time and effort into it is going to get you full credit for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, excellent. No, great questions. So hold on, where are we? I see there were a couple questions. Excellent. Yes, the milk is the access code for today's attendance quiz. If you have not done that yet, please make sure you do that so that you don't lose your spot in the class. So make sure you do that. Also, yes, I did want to talk since we're talking about the lab manual can be purchased or rented from places like Chegg and places like that. However, as I just mentioned, you've got a bunch of homework assignments in them. So make sure that you are able to download those, either print them out or notate them in Adobe or something like that, and then print them so that, or save them as PDFs so that you can turn them in for grades. So it doesn't do you any good if it's just a read-only version. And remember, if you have me for 431, you're going to, and I would say probably close to half of the instructors use this lab manual, so for 431 as well. So if you're renting it, remember, you're going to have to rent it for 2 semesters if that is the case. Yes, Stephanie.
So I'm sorry, I'm just getting a little confused. For the lab manual, do you know what the title is of the one that you want us to purchase?
Yes, it is. It is Exploring Anatomy and Physiology in the Laboratory. And again, this is all in the syllabus as well. So if you go to the syllabus, you can see everything that you need. And it's got to be the 3rd edition. The picture of the woman with the brain.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Speaking of textbooks, I know some of you have purchased the textbook bundle. We're talking about the lab before, but for the textbook bundle, and it was on back order. I spoke with the publisher yesterday, and they have at least 50 copies of the bundle at their warehouse that they are shipping out. So those should be available within the next couple of days. The other thing that they've told us is if you are not able to get it in time, what they will be able to do is, because remember, everybody's got that free 2-week trial to the Mastering A&P that has the e-text in it that way. And if they're not able to get it to us on time, they will be able to extend your access to the mastering A&P for an additional 2 weeks if that's necessary. So they will be able to do that for us. All right, well, I can't be a part of you giving away free copies of the PDF of the textbooks, so I will just ignore that in the chat. All right, questions on any of that? So this is our game plan, and as I mentioned, also the other lab simulator is the PhysioX, which again is the one we looked at that does those lab reports that you'll be turning in as well. All right, so that is the game plan for today. And again, if you've not done so already, please fill out the attendance quiz. The access code is MILK. Everybody needs to do that, or you will be dropped from the class or not able to add. All right, the other bit of introductory stuff that I wanted to talk about today is twofold. One, I want to talk a little bit about the Proctorio quizzes that you guys have been taking. There are some quick notes I wanted to make about that. Stephanie, did you have another question, or is that hand up still up from before? All right. Perfect. Okay, excellent. On the Proctorio quizzes, one of the things that you need to make sure you do is to scan your entire area, not just the stuff to the right of you, but your entire work area. And again, as I talked about in the last class, I'm not so much worried about the decorations on your wall. I want to see your workspace. So show me the wall behind your computer. Show me your desktop. You need to show me that the area surrounding you is clear of materials. As I mentioned in the getting started module, it has 3 examples of students who I got the permission to share their videos that shows the appropriate scanning of that. So make sure you do that. Also, make sure you have appropriate lighting. Again, can't be completely in the dark. I have to be able to see your workspace. You have a little image of your video. You can turn that off if it distracts you, but there is a little image of the video for you there so that you can see. And if you can't see yourself, then that means I can't see yourself. The other thing you have to worry about is if you have a bright window behind you, right? I've got my shirt up there because there's a big crack in the curtains that makes it very bright and backlights you. And when you're backlit, you don't show up well on camera. So make sure you have appropriate lighting when you're in the area to be scanned. Again, some of these things hopefully are obvious, but again, I don't want to just see your forehead while you're taking the exam. You have to be fully on camera during the exam. So try to, again, you have a little image of what the camera is seeing, so you know what you can see and can be seen. So please plan appropriately. You cannot have another monitor. If you have another monitor on your desk, I know someone, I don't remember if it was this class or the other class, was talking about they share a desk with their boyfriend, and they have a big gaming monitor. If it's not easy to move, then make sure you have a towel or a blanket or something draped over it so that it is obvious that it is not being used during the exam. And again, I know especially if you have roommates, if you have family, there's the desire to want to use those noise canceling earphones or something like that to be able to block out that noise and focus. But unfortunately, there's no way for me to know what you're listening to, so you cannot be wearing earphones during the exam. Yes, Brianna.
For those of us that do have that double monitor for writing papers, Proctorio won't let us continue until we've unplugged it. Is that good enough to just show the cables lying on the desk and the monitor turned off?
Unfortunately, I would say I appreciate saying you are correct. When you are using 2 monitors with 1 computer, Proctorio is able to block you from doing that. The problem is there's no way for me to know whether that second monitor is just a second monitor for the computer you're on, or whether it is a second monitor to a second computer that you could be using to access information. And so there's no way for me to know that. So the best thing to do is, like I said, just drape a towel or a blanket or something like that over it so that it is very clear that it is not being used.
Okay, good to know for the next exam. Thank you.
Yes, excellent. And again, that's why we have the Proctorio quiz. That's why we have the chemistry quiz. The practice lab exam we're going to do is going to use Proctorio. We are doing these on purpose because these are the tests that don't matter, right? I mean, there are a couple points here or there. The practice lab exam is worth 0 points. But I want to make sure we work out all the kinks of this Proctorio system so that when we get to the real exam, where you've got a lecture exam that's worth 100 points and a lab exam that's worth 70 points, that you are doing it correctly and not losing points for, you know, procedural things like this. That's the whole problem with being online. This class, as I've said before many times, I love this class because this class is hard. I don't have to be tricky. I can be very straightforward because I know to be successful, you're going to have to work hard. And so my job is to just get out of the way, make sure you learn the information and are successful. And the problem with being online is there's so many procedural things that we have to deal with. And so that's why I opened the class up a week early. That's why we have all these practice quizzes ahead of time, is because I'm trying to get all that procedural stuff out of the way so we can get to the things that are important, how to learn this material. All right. Last silly thing, but I have to have it on here because I've had it happen to several students. I don't think I've seen it so far in this class, but I know of at least 2 students and 1 teacher who did this. As you know, your job is to show your ID to the camera so that you can prove that you are you. The way you do that is there's a little red box that shows up on the screen, and you have to take your ID and line it up with that image on the screen. I have had 2 students, and like I said, 1 instructor that I've talked to who took their ID and held it up to the screen where that box was. Right? If you take your ID and hold it up to the screen on, where the box is, that doesn't do anything. You have to show it to the camera. So like I said, I appreciate that that's a silly thing, but I know at least 3 people who have done that. So I make a point of emphasizing it now. All right. Questions on that Proctorio quiz or how to use Proctorio? All right, excellent. The last procedural thing is those of you who have turned them in, I have looked at the student sheets and there were a couple things that I wanted to talk about. A lot of pre-nursing students in here, but a fair amount of other topics that people are interested in. And that's always good to have a nice diversity. A lot of you were pretty non-committal about the kind of things that you wanted about. You just wanted to know everything. And that's good because we're going to pretty much learn everything. But there was a variety of different topics people were interested in. We talked about this a little, but I wanted to emphasize it again. Remember, I appreciate that many of you are dealing with budgets. And I will say right off the bat, I don't get any money from any of the publishers for any of the ways that you get the material. So I don't care how you get the resources that help you to be successful in this class. However, a couple of caveats that I do want to warn you about is, 1, unlike that psychology class that you took, most of you going into the medical careers, having a good anatomy and physiology textbook to use as a reference to look back to as you move on in your career is not necessarily a bad thing. So these are resources you're likely to want to use again. Also, remember, this is a 2-semester class. So if you're renting your textbook, because it's cheaper that way, remember, you're also going to have to rent a textbook next semester as well. So you have to take that into account when you're looking at prices for these things. Same thing with the lab manual, as I just finished talking about. There are, I think, different levels of CHEG that you can use when you are renting a book from them. And some of them don't allow you to print them out. So make sure that you can access the materials the way you need to be successful with it. So be aware of that as you're going through those things. Thankfully, a small number of you, but there are a couple, so I wanted to bring it up. And again, this could be talking about people who are taking micro or just taking lots of units. If you have not figured out from Monday, this is a very labor-intensive class. And for many of you, especially those looking to going into nursing or dental programs or PT programs, grades matter. Those programs are very competitive, and getting an A and getting a B makes a big difference. This class is very labor intensive. Microbiology is very labor intensive, and there's only so many hours in the day. And so again, I don't know how you guys are as studying, but from past experience, I have had many students who trying to take 2 very labor intensive classes or 1 labor intensive class and 12 other units can struggle with that. And especially if you're taking this and micro at the same time, you can get a third of the way through the class, realize that you're not going to be able to get A's in both. And so you need to drop one of them. But at that point, you've already lost some of your tuition from that. It's going to count as a W for you for that. So it counts as one of your 3 chances to take it. And you need to make sure that you can recover in the class that you stay in. So again, since grades matter, I just want you to be careful and conscious of the workload that you're putting into this. Most A students in this class spend 20 hours or more a week studying this material. And so again, if you have 2 classes like that, that's a full-time job, not including the time that you're spending in class and the time that you have to spend eating and sleeping and talking to your family and doing a job and everything else. So I want you to be fully aware coming into this, what you're getting yourself into, so that, because I want you to be successful and I want you to get the grades that you want. So I want you to be aware of that. Obviously, if you've missed class on Monday or today, you're being dropped. After today, if you miss class, I will not drop you from the class for that. I appreciate that things come up, life happens, things along those lines, but you are still responsible for everything that we did on that day. You are still responsible for turning in information on time. And like I said, if you miss a test day, then you're not going to be able to retake that test in all likelihood. So it is important to make sure to be here, be active in the learning process. As we talked about last time, learning is much better when we're engaging with each other, when we're active. The whole reason I do this synchronously is so that I can ask you questions and you can respond. And more importantly, so that you can ask me questions and I can help you to make sure that you understand this information. As I said before, if I just wanted to hear myself talk, I would record these lectures and I'd still be asleep right now and you'd be sitting here watching just a video of me. So I'm here to help you to be successful. You need to be here to be successful. So I understand things happen after today. If you miss a class, again, it's best to let me know. Hopefully it's not on a day where we're doing a group project or something like that. If you miss a daily quiz on that day, you will lose those points and those can't be made up. But at least the lectures are recorded and put onto YouTube. So you do have a chance to try to make that material up. I said this in the last class, but I want to emphasize it again. I truly believe that the only bad question is the question not asked. If you have a question on something, then I guarantee someone else in the class does as well. So be the one that's bold enough to raise your hand and ask that question. And if you're not bold enough to say it out loud, the beautiful thing, there are very few good things about being online, but one of the nice things about being online is we have this chat window. If you're too shy to be on camera or too shy to speak out loud, then type your question into the chat screen and I can get it that way as well.
Professor, when you say 20 hours a week, you know, is it just like, okay, review the lecture, review what we, let's say, discussed Monday, discussed Wednesday? How can we best utilize those hours?
Well, the first thing that I would recommend is you need to spread that time out. I think that's one of the things, that is one of the biggest differences between this class and most other classes people have taken. If you take, you know, an easy class like psychology or chemistry or something like that, you can have that test on Monday. And because we have real life and jobs and families and all that, what somebody will do is they just lock themselves in a closet on Sunday and they study for 12 straight hours. And then they are successful on the exam. And you can get away with that in a simple class like that because that psychology class or that chemistry class has 2 or 3 big concepts. Right? The problem with this class is there's not 2 or 3 big concepts. There are 100 little concepts. And you can't sit down for 8 hours straight and try to learn 100 little things. Because by the time you reach hour 4, you've forgotten everything from the first hour. Right? One of the things I love about anatomy and physiology is the individual concepts are not hard. If I gave you a bone and I gave you an hour to study that bone, you would master that bone. You'd know everything about it. It's not like that. In a chemistry class or a physics class, You could look at a chemistry equation for an hour and not be any closer to understanding, or a physics proof. You could stare at that for an hour and not be any closer to understanding, right? What's hard about the bones isn't that the bone itself is hard. It's that you have 206 of them and you have 2 weeks to learn them. So it's not just about the number of hours, but how you spread those hours out. And there's lots of ways you can steal time to study. Have flashcards that you look at when you're standing in line at Starbucks, or you're sitting at a red light, or things along those lines. Find lots of tools that are going to help you to be successful and spread that time out. And that's really the best way you're going to be successful. Augustina, you had a question?
Yeah, I guess going off of all of that you just said. So like, you know how you were talking about the little concepts?
Yeah.
For the body cavities that were covered in last lecture, do we need to know every single body cavity? And then like everything under those body cavities?
So yeah, well, so I mean, the number of body cavities was pretty straightforward. So hopefully there weren't that many of that. I think a better example are like the regional terms, right? All that huge picture of the body with all those regional terms, right? That's a perfect example of one of the things I was talking about. If you tried to wait till the night before an exam to stare at that picture of the body and memorize all those regional terms, you're not going to be able to do that in 3 straight hours right before the exam. So it's going to take time and spreading that over time to learn that material.
Okay, so the only body cavities that we need to know were the ones covered in lecture, right?
Which are all of them.
Okay.
What body cavity didn't we cover?
Well, I was just maybe it's just me getting confused, but I thought there was like small little ones all over the body. So I thought we were going to have to like cover like millions of them.
I mean, when we talk about body cavities, we talk about primarily those two, the dorsal and the ventral body cavities, and the dividing of those up. I mean, yes, there are other, like there's the orbit for your eye, there is the external auditory meatus for the ear, the oral cavity, the rectum, the anus, things along those lines. I mean, those passageways and stuff like that. And we will talk about those as well. But those, I appreciate some of the confusion because people aren't always careful with their vocabulary. There is common vocabulary, and then there is anatomy and physiology. So for instance, if you get stopped at the airport and they decide to do a full body cavity search, right? They're not looking in your thoracic cavity, right? They're looking someplace else, but that's not what we really consider a cavity in that case. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, because I think I was thinking what you were just saying, like every single little one.
Yeah, we have lots of nooks and crannies, absolutely, but those aren't the body cavities. But we will talk about those nooks and crannies. We'll get to them eventually. Stephanie, you had a question as well?
Yeah, back to like the studying for hours type of thing. So I feel like that's what I've been doing, but I kind of feel like I don't even know where to begin type of thing. Like when after class, I just dove in and watched the videos, rewrote the notes, and I was like,
those are a perfect way to do that. So I'll tell you what I would recommend if you are, well, so again, this is only the first week, so that's part of it. But what I would recommend is come to my office hours and we can have a more meaningful discussion about techniques and tools and tricks that you could use to be successful. So I think that might be the best way to handle something like that. If you're already feeling overwhelmed, then let's talk and come up with a game plan and be more specific that way.
And I think you said you had the free PDF, but the mastering, if you got it through the Pearson, it has quizzes, it has critical thinking questions that can really help you think of it in different ways or force you to think of it in a different way. So that I did a few of those and it was pretty helpful.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Those the chapter quizzes, the section quizzes are a great tool in the Mastering E&P. Absolutely. All right. Excellent. Last and definitely least, a couple people were asking about my information. As I said, I've been teaching at American River College for 15 years now. I've been teaching in total close to 20 years. I did both my graduate and undergraduate work at UC Davis, where I got a PhD in neuroscience, studying the development of the visual system. Why I teach is primarily because it's anatomy and physiology. I don't think it wasn't that I was so much passionate about teaching, although I do really enjoy teaching. I love teaching in this environment. I love teaching at the college level. I love teaching a class like this where people are here for a reason. So typically they're motivated, they wanted, they have a goal, they have a plan, and it is a very fun population to teach. So this is a really enjoyable class, and it's what I've been primarily teaching for the past 15 years. And I just really enjoy it. So there you go. That's me. All right, excellent. So that is all of the introductory stuff. So at that point now, I want to get into our lecture. I went mute. Can you not hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, sorry. Make sure my microphone is plugged in. All right, so we skipped this at the end of last class, so I want to go back to this because we ran out of time. When we were talking about body cavities and the location of organs and the protection of organs, the other thing that we have to talk about is water. Us here in Sacramento probably know this better than most. Is the distribution of water and the distribution of ions in the body important? If you were to say, not so theoretically, drink a massive amount of water in a very short period of time to win what is now an incredibly antiquated video gaming system, can that upset the balance of ions and water in your body, leading to cellular damage, leading to organ failure, leading to death?
Yes.
Don't we for a we? Anybody remember that? I know it's
I
getting.
do remember that. That was
Yeah,
like
I know
on
it's
the
an older and
radio.
older reference now, but it is something powerful that happened here.
107.9.
There you go, something very powerful that happened here in Sacramento. Absolutely.
Yep.
So knowing where the body is knowing where the water is in the body is very important, because we are mostly bags of water. 60% of your body weight is water. You have close to 40 liters of water in your body, and it's primarily distributed in one of two places. A large amount of it, about 25 of those liters, is actually found inside of the cells. Cells are filled with water, big bags of water with a whole bunch of stuff floating in it as well. And then we have the water outside of the cells, what we call the extracellular fluid. Some of that extracellular fluid is in the tissues that surrounds the cells. So cells have water both inside them and outside them. And then also a fair amount of it is also in the plasma of our blood that we use to transport materials throughout our body, like we talked about. So we use that plasma in the blood to transport resources back and forth to the tissues of our body. So our condition of our plasma affects the condition of our interstitial fluid, and then the condition of our interstitial fluid, because it surrounds our cells, influences and affects the cells as well. Yes, Amanda.
Is this part of like our serous fluid? I don't know if that's a silly question, but.
No, it's not a silly question. No, this is not including the serous fluid, because the serous fluid, remember, is on the outer surface of that membrane. So it's outside of the organ. So it's lining the
Oh, okay.
Yeah, lining the spaces.
Okay.
So that wouldn't be counted. All right, excellent. So I just wanted to go back to this. What we want to do for today, as I mentioned, is talk about our first major physiological concept. And that first major physiological concept, and really the concept we're going to be talking about a lot through all of 430 and 431, is the concept of homeostasis. Now, as you can see here, there's practically a paragraph explaining this. Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium in the body's internal environment produced by the ceaseless interplay of all the body's regulatory processes. And I know when I put this on the board, everybody furiously feels like they have to write it down. And that's good, because then you can call grandma after class today and say, hey, grandma, guess what? Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium in the body's internal environment produced by the ceaseless interplay of all the body's regulatory processes. And grandma will be impressed, and she'll send you 20 bucks in the mail. However, what the heck does that mean? We can take this concept of homeostasis and we can distill it down into a simple two-word phrase. There we go. Neil's cheating. Dynamic stability. Absolutely. What does dynamic mean? Yeah, constantly changing. What does stability mean? Not changing. How can you have dynamic stability? How can you have constantly changing, not changing? Well, give me an example of a condition of the body that we maintain the homeostasis of. Excellent, I like that. Body temperature.
Hormones?
Hormone levels, that's another good one as well, absolutely.
Blood pressure.
Blood pressure.
Blood sugar.
Excellent. Blood sugar. All great examples. Excellent. Let's take that first one. If I were to measure everybody's body temperature right now, absolutely every single one of you, as we all know, are going to be at exactly 98.6 degrees, right?
No.
No, absolutely not. Some of you could be, right? Again, because you've been sitting here listening to my lecture right now, you may be at 98.0. Some of you, because you're drinking your hot tea, could be at 99.1, right? Some of you could be at 97.9, right? It could be all over the place. And more importantly, if I took it 15 minutes from now, would it necessarily be the same?
No.
No, it could be up to 90.3. Maybe after the break, you run downstairs to get a snack and you run back upstairs. And so maybe it goes up to 91, or maybe someone opens the window behind you and it drops down to 95, right? It is dynamic. Your body temperature is constantly changing because of all of the things that are going around you. Something you're eating, something you're drinking, opening a window, exercise, it is all constantly changing. However, if I take your temperature, is it ever going to be 114?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Is it ever going to be 52? No, it shouldn't be. Absolutely. So while it is constantly changing, it is constantly changing within a very narrow range of values. So we have a very narrow range of values. And while it can constantly change within that range, it doesn't typically go above or below that range. And that's what we're talking about. This dynamic stability is this ability to fluctuate, but within a narrow restrictive range. It's easy to see with body temperature, but hormone levels, blood pressure, blood sugar, all those other things we talked about, they're all the same. Right? These things are constantly changing because you're eating or because of any number of other things, but it's within a narrow, stable range. And that's really about what homeostasis is about. Homeostasis is about maintaining balance. That's really what we're talking about. We're talking about this maintaining of balance with this dynamic stability. Now, we obviously need some way to control this. So what of those 11 organ systems that we talked about in the last class might be useful for regulating a process like this?
Your nervous system.
Nervous system.
Nervous
Your
system.
endocrine.
Excellent. Nervous and endocrine systems. Those two systems are the ones that are going to be responsible for helping us to regulate this process. Help us to maintain this balance. Right now, to maintain this balance, there are certain things that we need. And let's go to the whiteboard for this. Right. Again, we can think of this as our goal, and our goal here is to maintain balance. Obviously, if our goal is to maintain balance, that is going to start with a disturbance. Something that upsets the balance. So here we are sitting in class right now. And if suddenly the fire alarms went off at American River College, how would that affect your behavior right now?
anxiety, like your nervous system would start.
It wouldn't because we're online.
Bingo. Exactly. Absolutely.
Oh,
You were correct.
I was,
If we were in the classroom, it would disturb us, but none of us are in the classroom. So the alarm could be going off, you know, police could be coming, helicopters could be coming by. Unless you live across the street from American River College, it's not going to affect you at all, right? In fact, you may not be aware of this, but this whole time we've been talking, my wife has been sitting off camera, just blowing her lungs out on a dog whistle. Has it changed your behavior at all in this class?
No,
No, why not?
we are unaware of it.
Yeah, you're not able to hear it. Now, she's not really over there doing that, but if she was, you wouldn't be able to hear it. And so it wouldn't affect you. So yes, there has to be a disturbance, but the first thing we need is we need some type of receptor. And that receptor's job is to perceive the disturbance. We have to be aware that the disturbance is there. So yes, we have this disturbance, and then we need some receptor that is going to perceive the disturbance and make us aware of it. That receptor then sends that information to what we call the command center. The command center, as we already talked about, is some part of the nervous system or the endocrine system. And basically our command center does three things. It receives the information. Once it receives that information, it is going to process the information. And part of that processing is comparing the information to what we know. And then it's going to make a decision on how to bring the body back into balance. So it receives the information, processes the information, compares that information to what we know, and then it is going to make a decision based on that information. Once it makes that decision, it is then going to send that information to what we call an effector. And that effector's job is to bring the body back into balance. This is not an unusual concept. Most of you deal with this on a day-to-day basis, right? Because right now it's still kind of summer. So by 3 this afternoon, it's going to be up to 100 degrees again. I don't know if it is today, but let's pretend it is. Gets to be 100 degrees and your wife leaves, or your significant other leaves the window open. So all that hot air comes in. Luckily, we have a receptor. That receptor is a thermometer, I should say, that measures the temperature of the house. It sends the information to our command center, which is the thermostat. And the thermostat's the one that processes the information. It says the house is supposed to be at 78, and it sees the house is at 80. It sees there's an imbalance and it needs to do something about it. Now, can the thermostat bring the house back into temperature, back into balance?
no.
No. So instead, it sends a signal to your air conditioner, the effector, that turns on the cool air, blows the cool air into the house, and tries to reestablish equilibrium. Now, obviously, you don't have air conditioners per se in your body, but what type of things can be effectors in our body?
Muscle.
Sweating.
Now let's talk about muscles. Okay, excellent. I like that. So glands are definitely one of them. Absolutely. But let's come back to this thought of muscle. We haven't really talked about it yet, but is all muscle in the body the same?
No.
No. Muscle comes in flavors. What are the three main flavors of muscle in our body?
Skeletal, smooth, and cardiac.
Absolutely. And all three muscle types can be effectors. So all three muscle types, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands are all the things that can be effectors. And those effectors' job is to bring the body back into balance. Notice, as we mentioned, we see that here with our maintaining a balance here, and the example that I just talked about, although we flip it the other way around. As we get closer to winter, you have a disturbance, cold air coming in. You have the thermometer that senses that change, sends the information to the thermostat that makes a decision, the control center, which sends it to the effector, in this case, the furnace that brings the temperature up. Stephanie, go ahead.
Could you go back to the slide real quick?
You mean my whiteboard?
Yeah, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, just give me like 1 second.
1001.
Okay,
Get it?
thank you. Yeah,
Yep.
thank you.
Awesome. So we use the example of your house, and we also talked about the example of your body, right? It was nice and chilly this morning, so you stepped outside in your pajamas to get the newspaper, and the door locks behind you. And here's the problem. You don't wear pajamas. So there you are, naked on your front porch, and it was a little chilly this morning. You have those cold sensors in your skin that perceive that temperature change, send that information to your brain, which processes that information and sends our signal to an effector, in this case, our skeletal muscle, which causes us to shiver, producing heat and bringing our body back up to temperature. Yes, Aubrey.
I was curious if there was just one specific part of the brain that got perceived temperature.
Yes, our hypothalamus plays an important role in our temperature regulation. But again, we will get to that when we get to the nervous system. You don't have to necessarily know that yet. But yes, typically there are specific areas for specific functions. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. And so, yes, Augustina, did you have a question too?
Sorry, yeah, just really quick. Is there like certain stuff that can affect our body, like not making us realize that there's a disturbance?
So as I mentioned, obviously the key to being able to maintain this balance is to be aware of the information. So like I said, if someone was blowing a dog whistle right now, that is a stimulus that you would not be perceiving. And so it wouldn't affect your body or affect your behavior in any way. We don't necessarily need to be consciously aware of it. It's not like, oh, I'm a little low on calcium in my blood right now. I mean, you don't know what your blood calcium is, right? You probably don't know what your blood glucose is unless you actually have a monitor because of diabetes or something like that. These are things that you're not necessarily, you're also not consciously aware of your body temperature, right? But are there sensors inside of our body that are perceiving that information and monitoring that information and allowing us to do this? Yes. So theoretically, if there was a problem with one of those receptors, that could affect your behavior, sure. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, or I was thinking of like maybe if there's like certain like diseases or something that would like inhibit those receptors from being aware or something like that, you know?
I can't think of any diseases off the hand. The one that comes to mind immediately, and I was racking my brain trying to remember the name of it. But as you may be aware, there is a condition where people, for instance, don't perceive pain. Right. I don't remember what that condition is called, but the people's pain pathways aren't register properly by the brain. So they burn themselves on the stove and they're not aware of it, or they walk by something sharp and cut themselves and they're not aware of it because they don't perceive it, right? So those types of disorders could cause some type of imbalance that way. Yes, but that's one that jumped to mind right away. There may be others, but I can't think of any off the top of my mind. But theoretically, absolutely, that could be the case.
Thank you.
All right, and remember, oh, I'm sorry. Was there another question? No, just groaning apparently. All right, excellent. And remember, back in ancient times, and by ancient times I mean 5 years ago, when you had that thermostat control, you had to actually decide whether you wanted the heat on or whether you wanted the air conditioner on. But now, thanks to Nest, we have these smart thermostats where you can actually set a range. And then within that range, as long as it stays within that range, then you're going to be fine. So again, when it drops, then the heater comes on to bring it up. When it goes too high, the air conditioner goes on to turn it down. And so we have that dynamic stability, right? There are constant changes in your house. People open doors, people open the refrigerators, people work out in the gym, right? All sorts of things cause dynamic changes in the temperature of your house, but the temperature in your house stays within that range. And the exact same thing is true for the body as well. When you get too hot, you sweat. When you get too cold, you shiver. Dynamic changes of the body in a stable range of normal body temperatures. All right. Questions on that? All right. We have this pretty flow chart that again shows the same type of thing. There's some disturbance. We have the receptor that perceives it. It sends the information to the control center that makes a decision, sends it to the effector. So again, you step outside naked, you get cold, you start shivering, and then do you continue to shiver forever?
No.
No, of course not, because there is a feedback loop in this process. So homeostasis involves these processes, and then it also is constantly being monitored, constantly being regulated in what we call a feedback loop. And there are in fact 2 types of feedback loops. What are they?
Positive and negative.
Excellent. And because I understand language, positive and negative, that means one is good and one is bad, right?
No.
No.
No. But you are correct. There are indeed 2 types, negative and positive feedback loops. Negative isn't because it is bad. It is because it negates or cancels or reverses the original stimulus. I think this is the one that is easiest to understand. I used to have a ruler, but I don't know where it is, so I'll just cheat and I'll get a pen. If I was trying to balance this pen on my finger and this pen started to fall to my left, if I wanted to maintain balance, I have to cancel that disturbance and bring it back to the right. Right? We were just talking about that with temperature. Your body gets hot because you've been running around the room 16 times, so you sweat to bring it back down. Your body gets cold, you shiver to generate heat, and it brings it back up. So notice there is a disturbance, and then we are canceling that disturbance or reversing that disturbance. And that is a negative feedback process. And this is by far the most common type that is found in the body. And in fact, every example we've talked about so far, all are examples that use the negative feedback system. But there is a positive feedback system. Positive doesn't mean that it's good, but in this case, it actually enhances or it increases the disturbance. Now, again, if we try to go with our simple example of the balancing this pen on my finger, if it starts to fall to the right, making it fall more to the right doesn't seem like a good way to bring it back into balance. So my analogy kind of falls apart that way. And while there aren't a lot of examples, there are some important ones. What are some of the important examples of positive feedback processes that we have in the body?
Labor.
During labor.
Labor is an excellent one. Absolutely. Basically, late turn, baby is head down, face down, pointed towards the cervix of the female, trying to get out. And baby's head pushes against the cervix. When it pushes against the cervix, that causes the cervix to stretch. That is our disturbance. There is a stretch receptor that perceives that information and sends that information to our brain. And our endocrine system releases a hormone, oxytocin. And oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. When the uterus contracts, it pushes baby harder against the cervix. And we get a bigger stretch, a bigger signal, which sends a larger signal to the brain. More oxytocin is released and the uterus contracts more, stretching the cervix more, sending a bigger signal, causing more oxytocin. Notice each time it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Excellent. And Angie is correct. Another great example is blood clotting. You cut your arm. The damaged tissue releases chemicals, and those chemicals attract platelets. Platelets come and bind, and when they bind, they release more chemicals, attracting more platelets that come and bind, releasing even more chemicals, causing even more platelets to come and bind. So notice again, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger each time. However, remember the goal is still the same. We want to bring the body back into balance. Right? That uterus keeps pushing more and more and more and more until what happens?
The baby
The
comes
baby's
out.
out.
Yeah, baby pops out. Absolutely. Once the baby pops out, mom's body is back in balance, right? Life is no longer in balance, but your body is back in balance. And the same thing with the blood clotting. More and more platelets form into that area until finally so much platelets come to that area and attach, they form a platelet plug and they stop the blood loss. So notice whether we're canceling or we're enhancing the disturbance, the goal is the same. We want to bring the body back into balance. All right. Questions on that? All right, I have these nice flow charts. These flow charts are not from your textbook, but I like them. That's why I put them here in the lecture so that you can see them. Here we see an example of negative feedback. This is one we didn't talk about, blood pressure, but we see it works the same way. Your blood pressure goes up. We have stretch receptors in the blood vessels that perceive that information, send that information to the brain, and the brain sends a signal to the heart so that the heart doesn't beat as strong. And if it's not beating as strong or if it's not beating as fast, less blood enters into the blood vessels and blood pressure drops. And then we just talked about the example of positive feedback, that use of oxytocin causing the uterine contractions to pop baby out. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. Oh, yes, Augustina.
Sorry, I had one. So, like something for blood pressure, if it's constantly high, does your body still think that's a disturbance, or does it eventually just become like the body's new normalcy and your body doesn't react to it anymore?
No, unfortunately, chronic blood pressure is an issue because your body does still try to react to it. And in fact, that's perfect lead into what we were just about to talk about next, right? Obviously, our goal is to maintain balance, but if we are not able to maintain that balance, like if someone has high blood pressure, then that is a disruption in that process, and that we typically leads to some type of disease, or in extreme cases can lead to death. Absolutely. And so when we talk about those types of disruptions, we typically refer to them as disorders, which are an abnormality of function, or a disease, which is a specific illness. Stephanie, let me answer your question before we go any further.
So I was just gonna ask, so without the nervous and the endocrine system, like if one of them doesn't work or something goes wrong, then will they both just not work? Like,
well, again, that's what we're talking about right now. These disorders and diseases are situations where we're unable to maintain balance, maintain that balance for some reason. And those are disorders and diseases. So let's go back to the one Augustina was talking about. High blood pressure. Would that be a disorder, or would that be a disease?
Disorder.
Yeah, it'd be a disorder. It's an abnormality of function, a higher than normal blood pressure. It can be caused by many things. It could be caused by a hardening of the arterial walls. It could be caused by problems with blood pressure, with blood volume, all sorts of things like that. Absolutely. It could lead to heart disease because the heart has to work harder and it weakens the heart as a result of that, right? If I have a stomach ache, is that a disorder or a disease?
Disorder.
All right. If I have multiple sclerosis, is that a disorder or a disease?
Disease.
Right. If I have hepatitis, is that a disorder or a disease?
Disease.
Disease.
It's actually a disorder. What does hepatitis actually mean? I purposely use that one because it's tricky. What does hepatitis mean?
Is that a problem with the liver?
Yeah, it's an inflammation of the liver. What makes that tricky is one of the things that can cause an inflammation of the liver is a virus like hepatitis A or B or Q or whatever number they're up to now. If I had hepatitis B, then absolutely that would be a disease. That would be a virus that was causing an inflammation of my liver. However, my hepatitis could be caused by the fact that I'm drinking vodka for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 17 straight days. Right? So an inflammation of the liver is just a disorder. But you're right, there are hepatitis A, B, C viruses, and that would be a specific illness. Do we see that difference? Yes, Stephanie.
so you said inflammation of the liver is a disorder.
Correct.
And the stomach, you said stomach, like a stomach pain.
Well, we'll talk about systemic in just a minute, so we'll get there.
Okay.
Right. When diagnosing disorders and diseases, typically we are looking for recognizable signs or recognizable symptoms. A sign is objective and a symptom is subjective. What does that mean?
Well, a sign is therefore external, while a symptom is more internal.
Okay, I like that definition. I like that. Let's write that down. But I don't think that's quite perfect, because here's the question. If I measure your body temperature and your body temperature is 114, is that a sign or is that a symptom?
A sign.
Yeah, it's a sign, but it's your internal body temperature. So how is that external? Right? You're kind of right. I see where you're going with this definition, but I think we need to be a little bit more precise.
I thought that symptoms are what the patient is communicating or experiencing, and the signs is actual like facts of what your body is happening.
Okay, and so again, I like that. I like that. I think we need to be careful about that, but I think you guys are definitely hovering around the right idea. A sign is something that you can measure about your patient. So for instance, if I take your temperature, if I take your blood pressure, right? Those are things that are objective. Those are signs. Those are things that I don't know why this is all in caps, that I am able to measure about you. Whereas a symptom is something that the patient tells you about them. Now you got to be careful because when we talk to measurements, right, one of the things that when you walk into the doctor's office, they have those faces on the wall, smiley faces, sad faces, you know, gloomy faces, or they ask you, what is your pain level on, you know, from 1 to 10, right? That is a number. But if I'm asking you your pain level from 1 to 10, is that a sign or is that a symptom?
Symptom.
Yeah, it's subjective. That's a symptom, right? Because everybody's going to be different. Stephanie is clearly a badass. So she has a broken leg. Her pain level is probably going to be about a 1.5. I get an ingrown toenail, and that's an easy 7, 8 for me, right? So again, that is something that is subjective. So yes, you've got the right idea. If I have an upset tummy, right, that is a symptom. If my blood pressure is 350 over 175, that is a sign, and not a particularly good one either. Now, as Stephanie also talked about, when we are identifying these signs and symptoms, they can be local or they can be systemic, right? If I have a tummy ache or my ankle is sore, those are local. Whereas often fevers, especially fevers in little kids, when a little kid gets a fever, you can pretty much feel it on any part of their body. They're like little ovens radiating heat from everywhere, right? Whereas when class is done today, you're all excited because you're done for the week. You don't have to see me again till Monday. So you're skipping out to your car to run to Sonic and get your smoothie or whatever it is, your freeze, and you roll your ankle, right? It's going to swell up like a balloon, but it's not going to affect your fingers or your hand or your head or anything else. So that would be something that would be local. All right. So our goal is to maintain balance. And we have these disorders and diseases which upset our ability to maintain our homeostatic imbalance. But there's one other major thing that upsets our homeostatic balance. And what is that other major factor that influences our ability to maintain balance in our body?
Aging.
There you go. The other major cause of homeostatic imbalances is aging. In fact, that's how we define aging. Aging is a progressive decline in the ability to restore homeostasis. Give me some examples.
Immunity.
Immunity, excellent. Immunity is a great one, right? One of the things with the whole coronavirus, who were the first people we tried to vaccinate? The elderly, because their immune systems are typically less vigorous. Give me another example.
Could it be muscles getting weaker as we get older?
Sure, absolutely. Muscle atrophy, decrease in strength, absolutely. Give me another one.
Bone density.
Bone density, absolutely, right? And bone healing. You can actually hold a newborn baby at chest height, drop them, and they will actually bounce back into your hands. Okay, not really. Don't drop babies. But there are lots of examples of babies rolling off of changing tables. And if a baby rolls off a changing table, are they typically injured by that when it occurs?
No.
No, typically not, right? However, if you hold grandma at chest height and drop her, right? If grandma rolls off a changing table, is she just going to bounce and not be hurt by that?
No, she's more likely to shatter.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. She's going to shatter as a result of that. Absolutely. So definitely the density of our bones, how quickly they heal, all of those things change as we age. Stephanie, yes. Did you have a question? No. Okay. Excellent. All right. Spectacular. So there you go. That is our goal. And again, we're going to spend a major part of 430 and 431 talking about maintaining these homeostatic balances in our body. Savannah, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, can you just go over the examples of a local and systematic again?
So for instance, a local would be something like an upset stomach. It would be something like a sore throat, something like a swollen ankle, right? Local means it is just in one location, whereas systemic is a condition throughout the body. High blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, you don't just have high blood pressure in your left arm. It's throughout your body. We use the example of a fever, especially in little kids. When they get a fever, their whole body is hot as a result of that, right? If your glucose levels are low, right? That is something that it's not just low in your right ear, it's low everywhere in your body. So that is, oh yeah, skin flexibility, yeah, another great example of aging. So that's what I mean by local means in just one location, systemic means throughout the entire body.
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Any other questions on this homeostasis? All right, excellent. With that, then we are done with everything that I wanted to do for today's introduction, to finish our introduction to the class. So as I mentioned, what we are going to do now is switch gears and start working on our first level of our hierarchy and talking about chemistry. Now, before we dive into that, this is a good place to go ahead and take our first break. Savannah, do you have another question, or did I just not lower your hand last time?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. So this is a good point to take our first break. So we'll take a 15-minute break. So let's restart at 9:25. And I will start the recording again at that point. Again, one of the things that we are using a different system now. We were using Confer Zoom before, and now we're using the Tech Connect Zoom. It's not most of the differences in Zoom are pretty subtle. But one of the ones that I found personally that is annoying, and I haven't had a chance to figure out if there's a way to fix it. One of the things that I liked last semester when I started the recording, there was actually a voice that said recording starting. And then when I clicked it, it said recording paused. And so it helped me to remember to start the recording and to pause the recording. And we're not getting that now. So if I start talking and forget to hit record, please someone remind me. All right, so I write it to help me remind me, but you have to help me as well. All right, let's take a 15-minute break, and I will see you at 9:25. So thank you for that reminder. All right, so as I mentioned, it is time to move on to our first level of our hierarchy to talk about some chemistry. Again, you guys had to have a chemistry class coming into this. So what we're going to primarily focus on is our organic compounds. And organic compounds are basically molecules that are made primarily with carbon and its functional groups. And what makes carbon so useful for making big, complex organic compounds?
It's a covalent bond. It has eight valence electrons, so it can bond to.
How many bonds can it form?
4 or lose 4?
Yeah, basically carbon can form 4 covalent bonds. Absolutely, where it's sharing those electrons. Absolutely.
Oh, 8 total. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, 8 total. Absolutely.
Covalent.
So
Okay.
it forms many covalent bonds, and by many I mean 4, and that allows us to form big complex molecules. Now, again, this isn't a molecular biology course. I'm not going to, for instance, ask you to draw what a amine group looks like or something like that. But knowing what a hydroxyl group is, knowing what an amine group is, can sometimes be useful bits of information. So that list is there. But like I said, I'm not going to be testing you directly on it, but sometimes it can be useful. When we talk about these complex organic molecules that are formed, basically, we define them as monomers, polymers, or macromolecules. Now, what do I mean when I say a monomer?
A single.
Yeah, it's that blue square Lego. It's a building block, right? And that building block can be used to build things. Now, if I were to take 14 blue square Legos and put them together in a row, what would I have then?
Polymer.
Exactly, then I would have a polymer. However, if I wanted to build a Lego house, would I only be able to use blue square Legos to be able to do that?
No.
No, I could use orange rectangles and, pink triangles and purple horseshoes, or I think I got some lucky charms in there, but you get the idea. We could put a bunch of different ones together, and when we put a bunch of different ones together to make these big complex molecules, then these big complex molecules are known as macromolecules. And that's really what we're going to be interested in. What we care about in this class are those macromolecules. They are essential for the structure of our body and therefore also the function of the body. And macromolecules come in 4 flavors. What are the 4 types of macromolecules?
Carbohydrates, lipids,
Wait,
nucleic
hold on, you guys are
acids.
too fast. Absolutely, I love that. All right, so carbohydrates.
Lipids.
Wait, before we get to lipids, we'll get that in a second. When I say carbohydrates, what do I mean by that? What is the simple term for a carbohydrate?
Sugar.
Yeah, these are the things that we think of as sugars. Excellent. Someone said lipids. Excellent. And again, what is the simple term for lipids?
Fats.
Fats. Excellent. What's another one?
Proteins.
Nucleic acids.
Proteins. Excellent. Proteins. And is there a simple term for proteins? I'll save you that hassle. No, there's not. Proteins are proteins. And as a couple of people mentioned, and Angie wrote out, the fourth type is nucleic acids. Excellent. Those are our four main types of macromolecules. So basically, everything in our body is made up of some combination of these four macromolecules: our carbohydrates, our lipids, our proteins, and our nucleic acids. So there we go. Excellent. Let's talk first about our carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have many functions, but what are the two primary?
Energy.
Provide energy and structure.
Energy and structure. Absolutely. All right. Absolutely. Energy and structure are the two primary functions for our carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have a general structure where they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And one of the key characteristics to a carbohydrate is they have this 2-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. So that's fairly common with our carbohydrates. And as we talked about, we are primarily going to define our carbohydrates by their size. The smallest, the most basic of our carbohydrates are what are known as monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are typically made up, and I'll cheat here, they're made up of either a ring of 5 carbons, where there are carbons at each of the joints of this, or made up of a ring of 6 carbons. And their functional groups that come off of stuff like this. And this includes things like glucose and fructose, galactose, ribose, deoxyribose, and so on and so forth. Again, as we talked about, carbons are able to form many covalent bonds, and covalent bonds store energy. So when we break a covalent bond, we release that energy. And since these have a lot of bonds in them, they are our primary source of energy in the body. But these are also the building blocks that we're using to put together to make bigger, more complicated carbohydrates. And the easiest way we can do that is by putting 2 of them together. If we put 2 of them together, we get a disaccharide. Now, the way this works, let's cheat and go to our whiteboard for this. As I mentioned, these are carbon rings. I'm going to cheat and do circles just because it's easier for me to draw. Many of these have, as I mentioned, hydroxyl groups. And a hydroxyl group is basically an oxygen and a hydrogen. What happens when we form a joint between these 2 monosaccharides, or a bond, I'm sorry, between these 2 monosaccharides, what ends up happening is that they share an oxygen. So when we form this bond, notice what's going to happen is what is released from that is a dihydrous monoxide. And what's the other name for dihydrous monoxide? Water, exactly, H2O. So notice this process of forming the bond, we draw a water out of it. So when we form this bond, we use dehydration, synthesis. synthesis. We are putting something together and we are drawing a water out of it when we're going to do that. Conversely, then, if we want to break this bond, what are we going to need to break this bond?
Hydrolysis.
Right. Well, that's going to be the process, and you absolutely have the right idea. We're going to need water to break the bond. And that process of using water to break the bond, as you mentioned, is indeed hydrolysis. Hydro referring to water. Lyse means to split. So again, I've done an amazing job of drawing this on the board. But as you can see here with the pretty pictures from your textbook, we can see this a little bit more clearly. So notice to form the bond, we are pulling water out of the molecules to bind them together, dehydration, synthesis. And if we want to break them, we need water to split them, separate them apart. We can use this to form all sorts of vitally important disaccharides. Let's talk about some examples. If you take a glucose and a fructose together and put them together using dehydration synthesis, you get a sucrose. Where might you find sucrose?
Are you referring to the body?
No, I just
Or
mean
like-
in general.
Oh, okay.
Tell me a place in the world where you could find sucrose.
Sugar?
Well, but aren't these all sugars?
Well, yeah.
Table.
There we
Table
go. That was
sugar.
the term I was looking for. Table sugar. Absolutely, table sugar. So when you're at Starbucks and there's that big jar of white stuff, table sugar, that's sucrose, right? Absolutely. Or you could take a glucose and a galactose and put it together and you get lactose. Where might you find lactose?
Milk. Milk.
Cow's milk, absolutely, which conveniently enough is also at Starbucks. Absolutely. However, those are useful. Those are important, right? Especially if you're going to try to drink Starbucks coffee, you need a lot of both of those. But probably the most vital of all of the disaccharides for human existence, you take two glucoses together and you get a maltose. And what is it about maltose that makes it so vital for human existence? That we can't survive without it?
Beer, right?
Exactly. You use it to malt barley and you use malt barley to make beer. Exactly. Right. It's the only way I'm able to tolerate my children is thanks to maltose. All right. Questions on that? All right. So again, these together, our monosaccharides and our disaccharides, are collectively what we call our simple sugars, right? They're easily, readily broken down. There's a tremendous number of carbon bonds in them that allow them to be able to be used to produce energy. But as we also talked about, we need to be able to form larger complex molecules, what we call polysaccharides. And again, these polysaccharides allow us to do two things. It allows us to store large amounts of energy. This is too big. Or it allows us to form structures. Now, you may not have thought of it in these terms, but you're absolutely positively aware of this because many of you took advantage of this morning. Maybe you had a nice bowl of cornflakes, or maybe you had a baked potato for breakfast. And that baked potato was just chock filled with these big, large polysaccharides. And what were those big, large polysaccharides that we found inside of that potato? What do we call them?
Starch.
Starch, absolutely. But you know where else there is a ton of glucose molecules? In the grass.
Cellulose.
Yeah, exactly. In that grass in your front yard. How many people had a big bowl of grass? And I don't mean smoking. I mean like went outside and mowed the lawn and ate that for breakfast this morning. Anybody have front yard for breakfast?
No.
I woke up 30 minutes before class, so didn't really have time for that today.
Yeah, exactly, right?
I
So,
sat outside, but that's it.
while there is a massive amount of glucose in that front yard of yours, as someone mentioned, it is stored in the form of cellulose. Right? Cellulose, we don't have the ability to break cellulose down. So that's why you didn't have front yard for breakfast this morning, right? A cow can, but a cow's got something like 87 stomachs where they're constantly chewing it and spitting it back up and swallowing it back down into a different stomach. Or another great example is a sheep and a wolf. A sheep and a wolf are very similar in size, but the digestive system of the sheep is 2.5 times longer than the digestive system of the wolf. Why? Diet. What does the sheep eat?
Plants and cellulose.
Yeah, grass with that cellulose. What does the wolf eat?
Meat.
Meat, absolutely. Well, it eats the sheep. Yeah, exactly. It eats the sheep. Absolutely. That protein of the sheep is much easier to digest, whereas it's a lot harder to get the energy out of that glucose when it is stored in the cellulose form.
So humans cannot break down cellulose?
Correct. Right. And again, many of you probably have never had a nice bowl of front yard for breakfast before, but plenty of you have eaten corn on the cob. And how can you tell if someone's eaten corn on the cob a day or two later?
In their teeth.
Poop it out.
Well, okay, hopefully they don't still have it in their teeth 2 days
Hopefully
later.
not.
But you're right? If you look in the poop, you can actually see the kernels. Now,
Oh.
as it turns out, you're not seeing the entire kernel. What you're seeing is the shell of that kernel. The shell of the kernel is made up of cellulose. So what happens is our digestive system breaks down all of the good stuff inside, but that cellulose shell remains intact. And that's why it can be seen in the poop. Now, plants have 2 ways that they can store carbohydrates as starch and cellulose. Which of those do we use in humans? Starch or cellulose?
We don't use either. We use glycogen.
Ah, you're no fun meal. Absolutely, you are correct. We don't store it. Animals don't use either of those 2 forms. We don't store it as starch or as cellulose. We store it as glycogen. Absolutely. So we have our own major molecule. Every cell in our body has glycogen, stored glucose in it. But give me some examples of some cells that might have a larger than normal amount stored inside of them.
I think it's liver and skeleton.
Well, not close, not the skeleton, but skeletal
muscle.
Skeletal muscle, absolutely.
Okay.
For all those contractions, we need all that energy. So our skeletal muscle stores a large amount of glycogen. And your liver, because you're not constantly eating, but your body constantly needs glucose, your liver has the ability to release some of that glucose as needed to maintain your glucose levels in your blood. So yeah, so every cell has it, but those 2 in particular tend to have a large amount of it. All right, very important, very useful, but not terribly exciting stuff. So any questions on carbohydrates?
Professor, you said it was stored in the liver, and what was the other one?
Skeletal muscle. Now, again, I said it's stored in all the cells, but the liver and skeletal muscle has a large amount of it. Just for clarification, okay? All right, any other questions on carbohydrates? All right, let's talk lipids. Like carbohydrates, lipids, our fats, are primarily made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, the big difference between lipids and carbohydrates is lipids have far fewer oxygen in them. Why? What's so special about oxygen? What do you know about oxygen from chemistry?
It only has, well,
Oxygen can make only 2 bonds.
True.
that's what I was going to say, but
No, you're right. So you're right. Oxygen, we're on the right path. Oxygen forms two covalent bonds. Remind me again what a covalent bond is. There we go.
The sharing of electrons.
They share the electrons. And when it comes to sharing, is oxygen a good share?
No.
No.
Oxygen is not a good sharer. It tends to hoard the ions. It's one of the things that makes water so magical, right? When we have our water, we have those two hydrogens, and we have that one oxygen that they are sharing the electrons with. But oxygen tends to hoard the electrons closer to it. It's what gives oxygen a partial negative charge, whereas our hydrogens, because they don't get it as much, get a partial positive charge. And that's what makes water polar. And that polarity of water is one of the things that makes water so magical. It's why it hurts like hell when you do that belly flop off the high dive. It's why water expands when it freezes. It's why ions that are like that sugar that you put in your coffee in the morning can dissolve, because it has this magical property. But something else that has water in it is salad dressing. And when you grab that Italian dressing out of the fridge, what's the first thing you have to do before you use it?
Shake it.
Shake it. Because what doesn't like water?
Fats.
Fats.
Lipids.
Right? So since our fats do not have a lot of oxygen, they have very few polar bonds. And so our lipids are what we call hydrophobic.
Does that have to do with density at all?
No, whether
that
it was
part
on
of this?
top or whether it was above or below the water would be whether it would float or whether it would be beneath. But the reason it separates from the water is that lipids are typically non-polar. They are hydrophobic. They don't like water, and so they separate from water. And that's why, because they don't have a lot of polarity to them. So one of the keys to this is that they have very few polar covalent bonds, and that makes our lipids hydrophobic. Now, there are a variety of different types of lipids, 4 more types of lipids than we see carbohydrates in the body. And rather than sit here and rattle them all off, I'm going to identify some of the main ones for you. And then as we work our way through the class, we'll identify some more as we work our way through. Let's start first by talking about the most common type of lipid found in the body, and that is a triglyceride. Triglycerides are often what are referred to as neutral fats. Now, I will show you the chemical composition of this in just a second, but you're not going to be responsible for that on the exam, but we do need to understand its shape. So let's do that real quickly. A triglyceride basically has a large centrally located alcohol. That alcohol happens to be glycerol. And then off of that alcohol, there is not 1, not 2, but 3 fatty acid tails. And the key to these fatty acid tails is they're made entirely of carbons and hydrogens. So notice if I erase my simple drawing, we can see this here. Here's our glycerol. Here are some fatty acids, and we put those together, and that is our triglyceride. 3 fatty acid tails connected to an alcohol. And again, you don't need to know the chemical composition of the alcohol, just know the basic structure of this. And as I mentioned, these fatty acids are made up of strings. Let's cheat and do this. Let's go to the whiteboard. Here's our alcohol, and then This is made up of strings of carbons, our fatty acid tail. This will work. Excellent. And let's do one more of these because it was fun. Oops. And because I'm now bored of drawing C's, for the third one, I will just draw that. So there's our 3 fatty acid tails. But what it allows us to do is to play with this one up here. These fatty acid tails, as I mentioned, are made solely of carbons and hydrogens. And how many bonds can a carbon form again?
4.
4. So all these carbons are together in a line, but each of these carbons needs to be able to form a total of 4 bonds. And so basically all of these bonds are going to be hydrogens. So there's a hydrogen, there's a hydrogen, and there's a hydrogen, and there, and there, and there. And there, and there. Oops, I'm not gonna have enough room for all of this, am I? There we go. So notice that is what a fatty acid might look like. Now notice in this case, each carbon has the maximal number of hydrogens it can hold. Oh, that's not supposed to be capitalized, that's all right. And we give a fancy name for that type of fatty acid. When this fatty acid is completely filled with hydrogens, how do we refer to it? Completely filled with hydrogens. Some might even say it is, oh, I don't know, saturated with hydrogens. There we go. It is a saturated fat. However, notice carbons can actually form double bonds with each other. I'm not going to bother to draw the hydrogens on all of these, but I will draw the lines that represent where the hydrogens would be. Notice because these two are forming a double bond with each other, they only need 1 hydrogen on them. And so in this case, we form one double bond. And now suddenly our fatty acid isn't fully filled with all the possible hydrogens it would have. And how would we identify this fatty acid? Excellent, because there's 1 double bond, you are absolutely correct. We would call it a mono unsaturated fatty acid. And if, and I'll just cheat, if there were 2 double bonds, how would we identify that one? 2 or more double bonds.
A disaccharide? I don't know.
Well, 2 or more, so it's not di. 2 or more would be poly. There
Poly.
again, you may never have ever thought of these carbons and hydrogens and double bonds and one double bond or two double bonds, but I know you're aware of these because we've talked about in life with everybody saturated and unsaturated fats. And how do you typically tell the difference between a saturated and an unsaturated fat? Is butter saturated or unsaturated?
Saturated.
Yeah.
Is olive oil saturated or unsaturated?
Unsaturated.
Saturated.
How do you know?
One
If it's
is
solid at room
solid
temperature.
Yeah. Whether it's solid at room temperature. Now, both will separate from water because they're both fats. But notice, typically saturated fats are solid at room temperature because, as you can see, their fatty acids are all straight in a row. And if they're all straight in a row, they line up very easily and they solidify very, very easily. Notice when we have a mono or polyunsaturated fat, that double bond causes a kinking of the fatty acids. And when the fatty acids are kinked, they don't line up as well with each other. And so they're much more likely to be a liquid at room temperature. So again, I think most of us have heard of saturated and unsaturated fats. Which one's typically healthier for you?
Unsaturated.
Unsaturated fats, excellent. And we are kind of aware of the fact that one is solid at room temperature, one is liquid, and now we know why. And all of them are triglycerides. So what are these triglycerides primarily used for? What are their functions? What's the functions of triglycerides?
For storage.
Yeah, storage of energy, absolutely. Right? We use it to store our energy, right? Notice, as we talked about, covalent bonds store energy. How much energy is in this triglyceride? Okay, you don't actually have to count them, but you can certainly say that there's a heck of a lot more than there is in sugar. Right? Lipids actually have a lot more stored energy than sugars do in them. They're just harder to get at, which is why we tend to break down sugars more rapidly and more easily. And of course, we use that fat to not just store energy, but to be accumulated all around our body for protection, for insulation, for all sorts of important functions like that. So I keep telling my wife, I'm not fat, I'm just protecting my internal organs, right? So it provides that temperature regulation, that insulation, that protection, and it is a storage of energy. Very important, very useful, but again, kind of like carbohydrates, not terribly interesting. Here I'm not going to make you draw these, but you do need to recognize fatty acids. Again, they're made up solely of carbons and hydrogens. And like I said, the key, you can't always symbolically see the double bond, but you can tell the that ring doesn't show up at all. You can tell the double bond is there when the fatty acid is bent. All righty. We did that. Let's talk about a lipid that is much more interesting, and it is a phospholipid. Again, I'm not going to make you draw it molecularly, but we do need to understand the symbolic representation of it. And the symbolic representation is basically a large head and two fatty acid tails. There we go. One of these is unsaturated, so it bends, but for our purposes, we'll just do it this way because it's simple. As we know, fatty acids are all hydrogen and carbons, and they are hydrophobic. They are nonpolar. But what's special about our phospholipid is the head. The head of a phospholipid is actually polar. It is hydrophilic. It likes water. Why is that important? Where do we find these phospholipids? If you're not sure, you could just read it.
The outer layer of our cells, aren't they?
Yeah, they make up our cell membrane. When we draw a cell, and here, let's cheat. I'll move this over here, and this over here, and this over here, and this over here. So I can draw a cell. When I draw a cell, as we talked about, cells are filled with water. So when we want to make that wall of our cell membrane, the way we do that is by taking these phospholipids and lining them up with the tails pointing outwards and the head pointing inward so that the water that's in can interact with the polar head of the cell, and our cell can function and interact with its walls, and the stuff dissolved in it. Any problem with that? No one has a problem with that? I have a problem with that. Isn't there water outside the cell
The
too?
heads need to be out while the
Exactly. You're right. There's water outside the cell. So you're right. So I have that backwards. We've got to draw these so that the head points out and the tails point in. Wait, that doesn't work either. We have
Isn't it
water.
a double?
Yeah, we
Don't
have
they
water in both.
interlock?
Right. We have water in both.
Parallel.
So we have to alternate them, right? One is pointed out and one is pointed in. Is that how we do it?
Yes. Or no, like they need to
The
There you go.
tails first.
Exactly.
the tails need to be touching.
facing each other.
There you go. Heads out, tails in. Absolutely. The way we resolve this, and you are absolutely correct, is by forming a double layer. When we form this double layer of phospholipids, that allows the water and things in the water to interact with the wall of the cell from the inside and from the outside, but it's also then able to form a barrier that is going to help to form that wall that separates the inside from the outside. So again, as you can see, I've done an amazing job of drawing this, but here's our phospholipid. Again, you don't have to know the chemical composition of it, but here we see the symbol of it here. But this is the picture I really want to show you. Here we have those phospholipids arranged in a double layer. So our cell membrane is formed by a double layer of phospholipids. Oops. Where we have this central core of the fatty acids that is non-polar. This forms the barrier. This forms the boundary to keep things inside the cell inside and things outside the cell outside. But we have those polar heads that allow our plasma membrane to interact with water outside the cell and to interact with water inside the cell. Very, very important. And we'll talk about this a lot when we get to our second level of our hierarchy when we talk about cells. All right. Questions on this? All right, excellent. There are, as I mentioned, plenty of other types of lipids. Here, for instance, we see your friend and mine, cholesterol. Notice cholesterol has a very distinct shape where it is made up of 4 carbon rings and its functional groups together. Now, I know normally when I say the word cholesterol, everybody boos and hisses because we all know we're supposed to keep track of our cholesterol levels. But notice I said cholesterol levels. Are you supposed to have 0 cholesterol in your body? No, too much is
No.
bad, but too little is bad as well. Cholesterol is actually very important. Cholesterol, as we'll learn, plays an important role in actually forming our cell membrane. It forms our bile salts, which help us to digest our lipids that we eat. So that big cheeseburger for breakfast, you're able to get the lipids out of that thanks to those bile salts. And we use it to produce hormones, like our steroids. Here we see a couple examples. Notice these hormones here are both made from carbohydrates, made from cholesterol. We can see the 4 carbon rings, and you can see that their functional groups are almost identical. This must mean that these are almost identical in their function as well, yes? They're this similar in their structure, they must be this similar in their function? No, Mitch is right. That is not the case at all. In fact, one of these happens to be estrogen and the other happens to be testosterone. Are those similar in function? Do you want to just interchange those equally in your body? Use one on Monday and the next on Tuesday? No, absolutely not. So notice even subtle differences in these functional groups can have dramatic impacts on the function of the body. Now, we have one more major issue that I want to talk about here. All of these things, remember, are fat-based. And fats don't like water. And how are we going to transport these things in our body?
Protein synthesis?
Well, we're going to make them that way but using synthesis. But how do we transport it through the body? How do we get these things from one place of our body to the other? What organ system is specialized for transportation?
Oh, our cardiovascular?
Cardiovascular, and it transports in blood. And what is blood primarily made out of?
Water.
Water. And fats don't like water. So do we want to take these hormones and just pour them in our blood and hope for the best?
No.
No, of course not. So we need a special way to transport them. One of the ways we do that is with a special type of lipid called a lipoprotein. Basically, what we do with a lipoprotein is we take all of our fatty acids, we take all of our hydrophobic lipids, and we coat the outer surface with a candy-coated shell. And that candy-coated shell are polar proteins. And so when we put this shell of polar proteins on the outer surface, this is now a molecule that can be dissolved in the water of our plasma and can be transported from one place in our body to the next. So most lipids, when they're transported in the body, need to be transported with a protein shell. Augustina, yes.
So when say for like heart disease, when there's a buildup of fats like in your arteries, why does that happen?
Well, so like I said, there are different types of cholesterols. Some have a higher density, some have a lower density, some are better for us, some are worse for us. And as these things accumulate, they can start to increase the amount on that can form on the walls of our cells, on the walls of our blood vessels. So yes, too much of anything. And we already talked about the example of water. Too much water can kill you. So obviously too much cholesterol, too much of the wrong type of cholesterol can cause a thickening and a hardening of the blood vessels and can cause problems. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have any cholesterol, because absolutely there are good, important cholesterols in the body as well. Yes, Amanda.
So just to make sure, how we transport lipids or fats is through our cardiovascular system is that they form a polar protein surface.
That is one of the ways. One of the ways that we can do it is by bundling up inside of proteins. Yes. So basically we wrap it up in proteins so that it can be shipped where it needs to go.
Thank you.
Yep. All righty. Excellent. So again, there are plenty of other lipids. And like I said, we'll talk about those more as we get to the different parts. Where we want to spend a fair amount of time talking. Oh, and again, here's a pretty picture from your textbook that talks about lots of the other different types of lipids that you find in the body. But where I want to talk a fair amount, spend a fair amount of our time, how are we on our time? Actually, we're doing good, perfect, is to talk about proteins. Proteins are by far one of the most important and certainly the most common and most diverse of all of our macromolecules. As I've talked about, I teach the introductory class of 102 for this. And when we talk about the cell in that, we talk about the cell being a factory. And the job of that factory is to make proteins. Proteins are vitally, vitally important. And again, if you notice, they make up close to 20% of our body weight. Now, that in and of itself doesn't sound that impressive until you remember that 60% of our body weight is water. That means we're only 40% stuff, and half that stuff is proteins. Proteins determine everything about you: your height, your eye color, your predisposition to heart disease, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, whether you have blue eyes or purple eyes. All of these characteristics about you are determined by your proteins. Proteins are hugely, hugely important. Now, proteins, like lipids, like carbohydrates, are made up of carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens. But one of the big differences between proteins and those other two is proteins also contain nitrogen. Exactly. Now, as I mentioned, proteins are by far the most diverse in their structure. And so not surprisingly, they're the most diverse in their function as well. And we can see some great examples of this. Collagen is actually the most common protein in the body. So if you were randomly to reach into the body and pull out a protein, it would most likely be collagen. And if you were to look at a collagen molecule is basically made up of a string of building blocks in a big linear line. And it turns out there's not just one, but there's two, and there's three. Three long lines of amino acids forming this strand, or if you think of it, kind of a rope-like structure. And just like a rope, it has what we call tensile strength. What do I mean by tensile strength?
Easily broken?
Well, if it has a good tensile strength, is it easily broken?
No.
No, right? Again, there's 30 some of us in this classroom, and from what I've seen, you're all beautiful, healthy, strong individuals. So if I divided everybody in half, put half of us on one side, half of us on the other, threw a rope out in the middle of the classroom, and we spent the rest of the class time today playing tug of war, while we were yanking with all of our force on that rope, would we be able to tear that rope in half?
No.
No, it resists those tearing, those shearing forces. But that strength doesn't come from rigidity. When we're done playing tug of war, I can roll that rope up into a ball and throw it into the trunk of my car. So it has that tremendous strength. And that's what collagen does, right? When you grab your arm or you rub the surface of your arm, does the skin go peeling off? No, because there's collagen in there, right? If you want lips like Angelina Jolie, what do?
Besides filler?
Well, no, I don't mean besides, I mean filler. What is filler?
Oh, I thought you meant like maybe just plumping them by
No,
suction.
I mean filler. What is filler primarily?
Collagen.
Collagen. They inject collagen into your lips, and that collagen fills them up, gives them structure, but does it make them rigid? No. So again, that collagen provides that structure, provides that support. It's a vitally important protein. And like I said, it is by far the most common protein found in the body. However, it's not the only type of protein. Another very important protein is hemoglobin. Where do you find hemoglobin?
Blood?
in your blood, and more
Glucose?
specifically,
Glucose?
not glucose, although that's a good guess. Where do you find hemoglobin in your blood? There we go, red blood cells.
Red blood cells.
And what does that hemoglobin do?
It transports the oxygen.
Something like 98% of your oxygen is transported by hemoglobin in your blood. In our red blood cells, we have these globular proteins called hemoglobin that are made up of 4 subunits. And each of these subunits has what we call a heme group at the center of it. And that heme group has an iron. And that iron is where it binds to the oxygen and holds that oxygen so that it can be transported through the body. A single red blood cell has something on the order of 250 million hemoglobin inside of it. So again, if you think about the oxygen carrying capacity of a single red blood cell, and then when you think that a single drop of blood has something like 200 million red blood cells in that single drop of blood, you can see that there is a massive carrying capacity of our oxygen. Now notice this has a very different shape. It's more globular in its shape, whereas our collagen was more linear. So notice, as we've talked about before, the structure of the protein determines its function. Probably one of the best places where you see that is with a very special type of proteins called enzymes. Enzymes are a catalyst. Someone remind me what a catalyst does?
It speeds up or helps to make it happen at a
It
faster
speeds
rate.
up a chemical
Speeds up.
reaction. Absolutely. Now, if I'm burning a flame and I add oxygen to it, that oxygen makes the flame bigger. Is oxygen a catalyst?
Yes. No.
Anybody else? Well, I hesitated. So what do you think the obvious answer is?
No.
No, why not? It makes the
Is
fire
it has
bigger.
to do with temperature? It does not heat. Does a
Not a-
catalyst have to produce heat?
Not a bad guess. Nope, it's not that.
It
Anyone help
lowers
Amanda out?
the reaction point, or like the point it has to
True,
reach.
you're right.
to lowers it.
And a catalyst works by lowering the activation energy necessary. But
Mhm.
there's one other key to a definition of a catalyst. What's the other key to, again, don't get me wrong, it truly warms the cockles of my heart that you guys don't know a lot about chemistry, because chemistry is completely stupid and nothing good has ever come from chemistry. So it does warm the cockles of my heart that you guys don't know this, but there is a little bit of things we need to know.
Okay.
So absolutely, it speeds up the chemical reaction, but there's another key.
It speeds up the reaction without itself being consumed.
There you go, absolutely. A catalyst is unchanged by the chemical reaction. Yes, oxygen makes a fire burn bigger, but the oxygen is burnt up, it's used up. Whereas a catalyst or an enzyme is not changed by the chemical reaction. That means it can be used millions of times. And there are lots of examples. Lactase is an important enzyme in the body. And what does lactase help us to do?
Break down lactose.
Break down lactose, absolutely, right? That milk sugar we talked about, right? If you don't have the lactase enzyme, you don't produce enough of it, or if you produce a non-functional form of the lactase enzyme, we consider you to be lactose intolerant, right? And so now when you try to eat that 3-scoop ice cream sundae, you're not able to completely break down those milk sugars. It causes intestinal discomfort and other problems along those lines. Yes, Amanda.
And before we move on, so why do we test like a person's hemoglobin A1C for their blood sugar levels
So
or their glucose?
yes, I understand, but you're not measuring glucose, but hemoglobin A1C is a specific type of hemoglobin that is formed in relation to increased levels of glucose, long-lasting glucose levels. So it's more of a chronic. It's not, if we're looking for dynamic changes, you look for the measurement of the glucose levels. So as you can see that,
The glucose tolerance
if you're looking
test.
for more static, chronic types of difficulties, then yes, that is a specific molecule. And again, it's not necessarily the hemoglobin that is found in the red blood cells, as it is a different type of molecule associated with glycolysis, with the glycolytic breakdown of glucose, which occurs when we have too much glucose in the blood.
Okay.
Yep. Just like we have different types of cholesterols, we have different types of hemoglobin. And actually, you bring up an excellent point. One of the things that you have to remember in this class is believe it or not, every single thing we talk about in this class is far more complicated than we're discussing it in this class. The way I like to look at it is, in this class, the sky is blue, right? My youngest daughter is now a freshman in high school. If I were to go over there, she's not over there now, she's in school. But if I had woken her up this morning, walked into her room and asked her what color the sky is, what would she have said what would her answer have been? The sky is blue, absolutely. However, if I woke her up at 2 in the morning, would the sky necessarily be blue? If it's raining, is the sky blue? At sunrise, at sunset, is the sky blue? If the sky is filled with smoke like it's been the past couple of weeks, is the sky blue? No. Does that mean my daughter's stupid? Well, no, I'm just kidding. No, but the answer blue is a simple answer that is right most of the time, but the real answer is more complicated than that. And that's kind of how this class is. In this class, the sky is blue. We are going to talk about the major cases, the common cases, the normal instances of these things, but know that everything is more complicated. And so in this class, the sky is blue. When you get to med school, when you get to your nursing program, when you get to your sonography program, that's when you get to learn about when the sky is gray or the sky is black or the sky is purple or orange. But in this class, the sky is blue. All right, excellent. So again, lactase, if you can't eat ice cream, that's a little disappointing. Obviously, there are going to be some enzymes that are going to be much more valuable and important that could even lead to disorders and death if they're not functioning properly. And again, I said this, but I totally want to reiterate it again. The function of a protein is determined by its structure. So is it important for us to understand how it gets its structure? Well, I'm asking the question, so what's the obvious answer?
Yes.
Yes, exactly, right. Again, if you're not comfortable always answering questions in class, then answer the easy ones. When I give you the easy one, that's the one to jump on and be enthusiastic. Yes, I know the answer to this one. Yes, excellent, absolutely. The structure is going to be important to know. And so what we need to do is we need to talk about the structural organizations of our proteins. Now, as we know, proteins are macromolecules made up of building blocks. And those building blocks are amino acids. These amino acids are put together and broken apart in the same way that we do lipids, that we did glucoses. Notice we are going to use dehydration synthesis. And we are going to use hydrolysis. However, and I think I've mentioned this in this class before. Have I mentioned this before, how anatomists hate you? Okay, excellent. So I don't need to get on that rampage again. Absolutely. And so as we've talked about, one of the ways they do that is by needlessly naming things that they don't need to name. And this is a perfect example. The dehydration synthesis to form a bond between two amino acids, they give a fancy name to. Basically, that covalent bond that forms between the amino acids, they call a peptide bond. So basically, when you use that dehydration synthesis to put two amino acids together, you are forming a peptide bond. So peptide bonds are what hold amino acids together. Now, there are 20 amino acids. And again, if this was a molecular biology course, you would have to learn the names of them, learn their functional groups, learn all of those. I don't care about any of that. So you don't have to worry about being able to distinguish and identify different amino acids. But we will talk a little bit about how we put them together, the structure we use to form them. Again, when we form these peptide bonds and start putting amino acids together, small chains of amino acids are called polypeptides, and then typically multiple polypeptides are put together to make a protein. We kind of already hinted at this earlier when we were talking. Notice when we talked about collagen, we talked about how collagen was 3 strands of amino acids put together. So basically 3 polypeptides come together to form that one collagen protein. Or when we talked about hemoglobin, we talked about how there are 4 polypeptide subunits that come together to form a single protein. That is the hemoglobin. So these polypeptides are small sequences of amino acids that are then put together to make a protein. All right, I think, yeah, that's where I want to go next. So from here, like I said, we need to understand the structural organization of our proteins. But I think here's where the information starts to get a little bit thick. So I think at this point, this is a good point to get a quick stretch, get a quick biology break, do those types of things, get some more caffeine if you need that. So let's go ahead and take our second break. We will restart in 15 minutes, which looks like that's going to be 10:41. And I will start the recording at that point. Any questions before we take our second break? All right, I will see you in 15 minutes. All righty. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about the structural organization of proteins. And when we talk about the structural organization of proteins, there are 4 distinct levels to how a protein is made. The first, or primary level of structural organization, is just simply the sequence of amino acids. After all, that is how we make our proteins. We have amino acid 1, and then that is connected to amino acid 2, which is connected to amino acid 3, which is connected to amino acid 4, and so on and so forth, all the way to the end. And as I mentioned, while there are indeed 20 different amino acids in the language of proteins, and you don't have to memorize each one, right? Which ones are that are present in which locations, do they really matter? As we've talked about, a single polypeptide can be made up of can be made up of thousands, let's say it that way, of amino acids. So if we're talking about 5,000-10,000 amino acids in a single polypeptide, is the one that's in the 3rd spot, does that really matter?
Well, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there are many medical conditions that are caused by the change of a single amino acid in just one location. Probably the most common one is sickle cell anemia. Many of you have heard of sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a condition. Remember, we talked about how that hemoglobin is made up of globular protein subunits that are put together. There are 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits. And with sickle cell anemia, there is just a single amino acid in that chain that has been changed. And so what happens is when that hemoglobin gets into a low pressure environment, like in a capillary, what ends up happening is it causes the protein to unfold. And instead of being globular, it becomes long and linear. And these long and linear proteins cause the red blood cell to go from its normal donut shape to a big, huge, kind of elongated sickle-shaped person, which is a sickle-shaped cell, which is where it happens. And it actually can cause the cell to burst and cause all of that hemoglobin to be released into that capillary, causing congestion, causing damage. It can cause loss of blood vision from the decreased blood flow to the retina. There's all sorts of problems and pain associated with sickle cell anemia, and it is caused by the change of just a single amino acid. So absolutely, that primary level, the sequence, the order that we put our amino acids in and which amino acids we use absolutely positively is important. All right, questions on that? Now, one of the reasons this is important is because, as I mentioned, amino acids have functional groups. As I said, you don't need to know what those functional groups are, but some are polar and some aren't. And so, for instance, this first amino acid may have a positive functional group, whereas this second amino acid may have a negative functional group. And what do we know about positive things and negative things?
They attract each other?
Yeah, they attract each other, absolutely. So in this case, what could happen is this functional group and this functional group could be attracted to each other. Conversely, over here, both of these could be, this one could have a negative and this one could be a negative. And what do we know about things that have the same polarity? Yeah, they don't like each other, so they could push away from each other. These local interactions between these groups are what we call our hydrogen bonds, and they form our secondary level, structural level. Basically, the interactions of the functional groups cause local changes in shape. Let's say it this way. And these local changes in shape are formed by hydrogen bonds. Some examples of these are we can get a coiling of the amino acid strand. This is something that is called an alpha helix. Others can start to form this wave-like bond where we get layers of them together. It's what we call a beta sheet. And there are plenty more, but basically there are these hydrogen bonds forming local changes in the shape of a sequence of an amino acid. Now, of course, these are local. So let's talk about an example here. We may have a sequence of amino acids, a polypeptide, where one part forms an alpha helix and another part forms a beta sheet, and a third part forms another alpha helix. Each of these are local secondary structures, secondary levels of organization. But notice when we put them all together, we get the tertiary level of organization. That should be of a bar. And that tertiary level of organization is basically the three-dimensional shape of the entire polypeptide. So again, this little part here is a secondary structure. This little part here is a secondary structure. This little part here is a secondary structure. But when we put them all together, we get the entire three-dimensional shape or tertiary structure of this polypeptide. All right. So far, so good? Excellent. But notice we're still using the term polypeptide because remember, as we talked about, most proteins are made up of multiple subunits. So to get a fully functional protein, we need to talk about the quaternary. The quaternary level of organization. The quaternary level of organization, the fourth level of organization, is where we put two or more subunits are put together to make the fully functional protein. So notice here I have one subunit. Let's say, for instance, I added a second subunit, and that subunit was a little bit more angular in its shape. And let's say that I took a couple of globular subunits and put those globular subunits in there as well. And now when I put those all together, I now have a fully functional protein. Yeah, quaternary. Fourth. Oh yeah, you're right. I spelled it wrong. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not a good speller to begin with. And when I'm trying to talk and draw and write all the same time, it's horrible. And again, so yes, thank you for correcting that. Quaternary. Again, this is right 1 prime. This is 2 prime. This is 3 prime. And this is 4 prime. So yes, I spelled that wrong. I apologize. Thank you for catching that. There we go. Excellent. All right. Questions on that? All right. I've done an amazing job with my beautiful pictures here on the whiteboard for this, but let's look at the pretty pictures from your textbook as well. Here, as you can see, we have that primary structure where we have the individual amino acids together forming that primary sequence, just the individual amino acids. The relation of their functional groups cause local interactions. And again, those local interactions I don't know what this does. Causes local interactions. And those local interactions are caused by hydrogen bonds. And so we get things like the alpha helix, we get things like the beta sheets. Those are local interactions causing local changes in small portions of our polypeptide. But when you put all of those together, you get the full three-dimensional tertiary shape of our polypeptide. But most fully functional proteins are made up of multiple subunits. So that is where we have the quaternary, fourth level, where we're putting multiple subunits together to make a fully functional protein. And as we mentioned, the shape of this protein determines, determine its functions. No, alpha and beta are not the only ones. Those are just two examples. And they're the examples your book used, so that's why I use them as well. All right, as I said, I appreciate that this is, I don't know, there might be one in your textbook. You don't have to memorize the different types of secondary structures. I'm not interested in that. But what I am interested in is that, again, what we have here is a fully functional protein, and that shape determines the function. Now, as we talked about, if we change one amino acid up here, that definitely can influence and modify the function of our protein. But the other thing that influences the shape are these secondary structures, because these secondary structures are formed by hydrogen bonds, right? Caused by or more formed by hydrogen bonds. And what do we know about hydrogen bonds? They're super strong and they're unbreakable.
They're weak.
No, exactly. They're in fact the weakest type of bonds, right? They're very weak. And not only are they very weak, but they're highly susceptible to two things. What are the two things that hydrogen bonds can be strongly influenced by? Not so much water.
Oxygen?
No. Well, how many of you had eggs this morning for breakfast?
Protein?
Right. What happened to that egg went white when you put it in the pan? Was it white to begin with?
No.
No. What made it become white?
Heat.
Heat. So one of the things that modifies our proteins, breaks those hydrogen bonds or changes those hydrogen bonds, is temperature. And what's the other major factor that can influence and change hydrogen bonds?
Catalyst?
Not necessarily, although catalysts can speed up these reactions. No, heat and what else? Come on, I know somebody knows it. Well, so temperature is something, notice, we have to keep very tight control of in the body because our body's filled with proteins. What's another characteristic of the body, of the blood in particular, that we have to keep very, very tight control of?
Hydrolysis?
Blood pressure?
pH, there we go. Mitch has got
pH.
it. pH. Temperature and pH. If we change the temperature, change the pH, we change the hydrogen bond structure, we change the shape of the protein, and we can make it non-functional. And we have a fancy name for that. What's the fancy name we give for a protein when it is non-functional anymore?
Denatured.
Exactly. Denaturation. We denature the protein. Like I said, that's what you're doing with that egg in the morning. When you put that egg in the pan and add heat, you're denaturing it. Changing the composition of it. Can you get it to go back to white? I mean, go back to clear after it's white? No, right? You've changed the shape, you've changed the function. In the case of cooking the egg, you've completely and irreversibly changed that protein. And that's really the take-home message. As we talked about, two of the major factors we need to maintain control of, tight control of in the body is body temperature and the pH of our body, the pH of our blood, the pH of our fluids. Because if those change dramatically, then our functions of our proteins change.
I have a question or clarification.
Yeah.
So we need to understand the levels of, the levels of organization, and then we need to know what can change the protein. So, and that's in the primary and secondary level.
Right, absolutely, right?
Okay.
Things like this that have levels or descriptions or steps, this is definitely the kind of thing that makes a perfect essay question.
Right, okay.
But the
Thank
other
you.
important thing is, why are we learning this? Right? Why do we care about these levels of organization? And this is why. To understand how things like the sequence of amino acids, things like temperature and pH, how these things can modify the shape of our protein. And when you change the shape of the protein, you change its function. All right, questions on that? All right, excellent. A perfect example of where this and why this is important has to do with enzymes. One of the things in anatomy and physiology we never do is we never use words like never, and we never use the words like always, because there are always exceptions. However, every single chemical reaction that has currently been found in the body, there is an enzyme that helps to make it occur faster. Now, that doesn't mean that every single chemical reaction that takes place in the body uses an enzyme, but every single chemical reaction that takes place in the body, we have found an enzyme to help that process. Now, does that mean somewhere along the line we might find a chemical reaction that doesn't have an enzyme for it? Sure, but it hasn't happened yet. And that should help us to get an appreciation of just how important enzymes are. So let's talk about enzymes. Enzymes, as we mentioned, are biological catalysts. They're usually pretty easy to identify because they end with the suffix ase, like we saw with lactase, which breaks down lactose. Or what do you think a lipase breaks down?
Fats.
Yeah, lipids, exactly. Absolutely. As we mentioned, as someone mentioned actually, enzymes, catalysts work by lowering the activation energy that basically makes it easier for the chemical reaction to take place. And that basically speeds it up. Instead of having to wait for things to randomly bump together with the right speed, we can get them to work properly. But as we also talked about earlier, there's another big key to our definition of a catalyst. And what is that other big key?
They remain unchanged.
Yeah, the enzyme is unchanged by the reaction. And the advantage of that is a single enzyme can be used to facilitate millions of chemical reactions. Now, enzymes also are highly specific. They have a special area. They're typically globular proteins, big globular proteins, but in that protein, there is going to be a very precise, very specific region for a very specific substrate. So for instance, lactase has a binding site where only the lactose molecule can bind to it. And this area is what's called the active site, or it's sometimes referred to as the binding site. That's a fine name for it as well. And lactase does only one thing. It just breaks down the lactose sugar, right? So again, they can be very specific. They can be very precise. But they are proteins. And so like proteins, they are very sensitive to temperature and pH. Your mouth is a perfect example of this. One of the things you can do after class today, because you have the nice long 5-day weekend before we have to meet again, is gather your family around the table, give everybody a paper towel and a little square of white bread. Take the paper towel to dry off your tongue and put the white bread on the center of your tongue. Your mouth will start to produce saliva. That saliva will mix with the bread. And inside your saliva is a special enzyme called salivary amylase. And guess what salivary amylase does?
Breaks down the bread.
Yeah, it breaks down carbohydrates. And it'll break it down into the simple sugars, and you'll start to taste the sweetness on your tongue. You also, in your mouth, in your tongue, produce an enzyme called lingual lipase. Guess what lingual lipase breaks down? Pretty sure I already asked this question, so the answer should be easier the second time. What does a lipase break down?
Carbs.
Proteins?
No, wait, fat.
Fats.
Fat,
Lipids.
lipids.
Exactly, lipids.
Lipids,
It breaks
sorry.
down lipids, absolutely. Right? Does that mean that while you're sitting around with the family, you can all take little cubes of butter and stick it on your tongue, and you'll be able to taste the alcohol as it breaks it down, taste the fatty acids as it breaks it down?
No.
No, that lingual lipase is non-functional in your mouth. However, when you swallow it down into your stomach, suddenly it becomes functional and it starts to break down that fats. Why? Why does it work in your stomach, but it doesn't work on your tongue? Shy, doesn't like to be watched. There you go. Agostina's got it. pH. What's the pH of your mouth? Anyone know what your pH in your mouth is? Yes. 7, 4.
6.7 is average.
Yeah, it's about 7, relatively neutral. What is the pH in your stomach? Well, careful. It has way more acid, but in the pH scale, is that a bigger number or a smaller number?
Smaller.
So smaller.
Smaller number, absolutely. So it's closer to 1 or 2.
Yeah.
When basically that lingual lipase is produced in an inactive form. And then when it gets to your stomach, the pH change causes it to, let's use fun vocabulary, undergo a conformational change. Whoops. All right, another thing you can call grandma up. Say, hey, grandma, guess what? My stomach causes proteins to undergo a conformational change. And she'll be real impressed and she'll send you $20 in the mail. Undergo a conformational change is just a fancy way of saying that it changes shape. So it changes shape because of the change of pH, and now suddenly it is functional. You guys were talking about images and illustrations and figures in your book. Your book has a pretty nice one. Notice it shows that globular protein, that is the enzyme. It has the specific binding site to it, the active site, where in this case, a couple of amino acids come in. It facilitates the chemical reaction. A peptide bond is formed. And notice our enzyme is the exact same after the process as it was before. So again, serves that function as an enzyme. And I like this picture and it's a good illustration. The only thing I don't really care for about it is it kind of shows the enzyme of being pretty passive in this process. And that doesn't have to be the case. Here, we actually see a symbolic illustration of a different enzyme found in the body. Notice we have the globular component of it. And here in pink, we have its active site. Notice 2 molecules come together and bind to it. And when those 2 molecules bind to it, once again, our enzyme undergoes a conformational change. It changes its shape. And as it changes its shape, it brings the 2 molecules together, facilitates the chemical reaction, changing the molecule as a result of it. But notice as soon as it's done, it opens back up And notice again, the enzyme is exactly the same after the chemical reaction as it was before. So don't go thinking enzymes are passive in this process. They can be very dynamic. They're just not used up. They're not changed by the chemical reaction. So they can be used again and again and again and again and again and again and again. All right. Questions on that?
Isn't it true that
No.
all enzymes are proteins, but not all proteins are enzymes?
Yes, absolutely. Right. All enzymes are comprised of proteins, but as we mentioned, proteins serve lots of functions. Hemoglobin is a protein. Collagen is a protein, right? Those are two proteins that we've talked about that serve other functions in the body. And so there are dozens and there are hundreds of proteins in our body. Enzymes is just one type, a very important type, but just one type. Aubrey, you have a question?
Yeah. So like any other protein, is it frequently broken down and built back up again, enzymes?
So you are correct. Proteins, like most of the molecules in a cell or in our tissues or in our body, can be degraded. They can be broken down. They can become non-functional. And so we, yes, are constantly making more to replace them.
Is that
Again,
catabolism and anabolism? Or is it something different?
you're just thinking of it in terms of chemical reactions. Yes, when you're thinking about the breakdown or the buildup of chemical reactions, building things up or breaking things down. It doesn't have to be that complicated. I mean, a great example of, again, a non-enzyme protein that is constantly being broken down and made is hemoglobin. Your red blood cells are basically big bags of hemoglobin. They don't have nuclei, they don't have organelles, they're not capable of any kind of real function. They're just big bags of hemoglobin. And as such, a red blood cell only lasts about 100 to 120 days. So every day you are destroying millions of old used up red blood cells. And so each day you need to make millions of new red blood cells to replace them. And every single one of those new red blood cells you're making, remember, needs 250 million hemoglobin inside of them. So yeah, so we are constantly breaking down and building up proteins as needed. Yep. Excellent question. Any others? All right, that is proteins. We'll obviously talk about them a lot more as we continue through the class, but that's a good introduction to them. And we still have one more macromolecule we need to talk about, and those are our nucleic acids. Again, nucleic acids are macromolecules made up of building blocks. The same way that amino acids make up proteins, nucleotides make up nucleic acids. Here, we see what a nucleotide looks like, and let's cheat and go to our whiteboard for this. A nucleotide has three components. The first of those three components is a 5 carbon sugar. Ugh. Again, I'm not going to bother drawing the carbons at the corners of this structure. No. But we have this nice house-shaped, home plate-shaped 5 carbon sugar that helps to form the basis of our nucleotide. And any idea how many possible 5 carbon sugars can be here? All right, I'll ask the question this way. It will be one of two types. What are the 2 possible sugars that could be found here in our nucleotide? No? All right, I'll give you one of them. One of them is the sugar ribose. And what's the other one? This one I won't give you. I will wait. There we go. Close. Not quite diribose, but you're getting closer with that.
Polyribose?
There it is. Sarah's got it. Deoxyribose. Excellent. So you're going to have one of those two sugars, either ribose or deoxyribose. The second component is a phosphate group. Now, you don't need to know the chemical composition of a phosphate group, but the one thing you do need to know about it is a very negative molecule. So we'll put a big, huge negative sign here in the center to remind us of that. All right, and the third component of a nucleotide is a nitrogen base. Oops, I needed to put a 2 there. Anyone know how many types of nitrogen bases there are? Come on, this should be getting us closer to the things you guys know about this. You know this even if you don't think you know this. More than 2. Actually, more than 4. At least a little bit more than 4. Not that many. There you go. Maria's found it. 5 types. All right, we'll start easy. Give me the letters associated with these 5 bases. You don't have to give me the names right off the bat. Just give me the letters. A is one of them. Excellent. There we go. G, T, C, and U. Excellent. Those are the letters associated with them. And so now we can figure out their names. They're adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and uracil. These are the 5 possible bases. So you throw one of these up here, like say, for instance, we throw an adenine in here. Oops. In here, we have a 5 carbon sugar. Let's for heck's sake throw in a ribose and have that phosphate at the end. And lo and behold, we have a nucleotide. And what do we use these nucleotides? What do we use these nucleic acids for?
Communication or transportation?
Okay, well, I like that. DNA and transportation, kind of. Anything else? RNA, excellent. However, one of the things that I should remind you in this class is that spelling counts. So on an exam, are you going to get away with just putting DNA in there for an answer to an essay question or to a lab question? You get partial credit, but I consider that to be a spelling error. Abbreviations are spelling errors. So what does DNA actually stand for?
It's a deoxyribocnucleic ribonucleic acid.
There you go. And what do we use that deoxyribonucleic acid for?
It's instructions to make protein genes.
There you go. It's the instructions to make proteins, right? And in the form of genes, absolutely. These are our genes, as we talked about. Those genes make proteins that make you left-handed or right-handed, give you A blood type or O blood type, right? Give you curly hair or no hair, right? And all of those things in between. Absolutely. And this DNA is important, so it's protected, so it's locked up in the nucleus of a cell so that it can be protected. But we want to use that information. And that's where the RNA comes for. And what does RNA stand for?
Ribonucleic acid.
Excellent. Ribonucleic acids are temporary copies of the information that are used to make the proteins. And so we have this RNA and this DNA. Typically, these are arranged in strands. So what happens is our sugar and our phosphate form what we call a backbone. And then the bases are basically the letters of the alphabet. They contain the information, the instructions of life. All right, if we sneak back to our pretty picture here, again, we'll talk more about these nitrogen bases. We've named them already. We'll talk about the different classes, purines and pyrimidines. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about mitosis. We'll talk about even more when we talk about protein synthesis. We will actually go through the process of protein synthesis. But this is a good starting point for understanding what it is that these nucleic acids do for us. Questions on that? All right, I'm going to go back to my picture here. We understand what DNA and RNA is in the simplest sense and how to make them. So I'm going to cheat and go ahead and remove that for right now. But I'm going to leave this picture with the adenine, with the ribose sugar, because as it turns out, there's one other, again, being the instructions for life is a pretty darn important function. But it turns out nucleotides have one other major important function as well. And not just any nucleotides, but this nucleotide right here. A ribose sugar with an adenine nitrogen base. Remember, I mentioned that phosphate group, as I talked about, is super, super negative. And if I just on a whim decided why I wanted to attach another phosphate to the first phosphate, would that be something that would be particularly easy to do? What do you think? Do two negative things like each other?
No.
No. So it would require a lot of energy. I think that's a technical term. It would require a lot of energy to form this bond between the two phosphates. And if I was feeling particularly frisky, I might go so far as to try to add a third. Now, if one negative thing didn't like me adding a second, Are two negative things going to like me trying to add a third? No. So not surprisingly, this is going to require, and I think again, the technical term is lots and lots of energy to form this bond. So I'm going to have to put a massive amount of energy to form this fancy molecule. And if I'm not going to put this much time and energy into this molecule, I might want to give it a name. And what would I call, oops, hold on, leave that there. What might a good name for this molecule I've just formed be? There we go. ATP is absolutely 100% correct. However, remember, we don't want to use abbreviations in this class. So what would we call this? There we go. Adenosine, which is basically the adenine and the ribose, triphosphate. Which you are absolutely correct. Once you have written it out once on an essay question, you can then abbreviate it ATP. And what is adenosine triphosphate?
The molecule that carries the energy.
Yeah,
Things
it's
down.
it's an energy molecule that helps the cell do work. How does it do that? How do we use this energy to do work?
Protein.
The breakdown of molecules.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember, these bonds are storing, if it requires lots and lots of energy, that energy is stored in the bonds. So if this energy is stored in the bonds, then if we break the bond, we release that energy. Right? We have a fancy name for this. We say we split the ATP. And when we, let's do this over here. When we split the ATP, as a result of that, we get a phosphate that we've ripped off. We get a massive amount of energy. And what are we left with?
Adenosine diphosphate.
Right. For up here, I'll abbreviate that ADP, but you're absolutely correct. As a result of that, we get adenosine diphosphate. And as we talked about, this releases lots and lots of energy. But notice ADP is still a high energy molecule. So we can actually split the ADP. As a result of that, we get another phosphate ripped off. We get some energy, not as much, but we get some energy. And what are we left with as a result of that? There you go.
Adenosine monophosphate.
MP, which would be adenosine monophosphate. There you go. And we've done a nice job of doing this here on the whiteboard. But notice if we look at the pretty picture from your textbook, it does a nice job of showing this as well. So again, here we have the adenosine, a ribose sugar, and an adenine, a nitrogen base. With the one phosphate on it, it is adenosine monophosphate. Here we have that high energy bond that makes it the diphosphate. and the very, very high energy bond that makes it the triphosphate. And so these molecules, notice, not only are these, again, most people here have thought of DNA, know about DNA, know about RNA. Most people in here have heard of ATP before, but they don't realize they're related. ATP is a nucleotide. It is part of our nucleic acids. So obviously, yes, our DNA and RNA are the instructions for life, but they also provide the energy necessary to do all of those functions as well. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. That is everything I wanted to do from a chemistry standpoint for today, but there is a little bit more information that I do want to go over with you for this. I want to talk a little bit as we move forward towards the microscope stuff. Since we're not doing the microscopes in the class, I do want to remind you, you are still responsible for the care and feeding of the microscope, how they work, how they function. You definitely are responsible for that information. The other thing, because I had a couple questions about this, and so I wanted to go over it with the class. So give me a second to get to the right place. A couple people asked me about study guides, and so I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about that as well. All right. Here is our homepage. Here are our modules. Again, the getting started information we've talked about already, study tools we've talked about, handouts. So again, notice here is where we have all the lecture handouts of everything that we're talking about. And also there's a place for lab handouts. Notice the only lab handout we have in this section is actually a histology handout. There is no direct assignment associated with this. This is really to help people understand the concept of histology, right? Most people have heard of things like superior and inferior, or anterior and posterior, but not a lot of people have done microscope work before. And for some people, the challenge of taking a three-dimensional structure and slicing it and just looking at a single slice of it and being able to relate that single slice to the whole can be challenging. One of the probably the hardest things you're going to have in this class is getting used to looking at microscope slides. Because even though we're not looking at microscopes, you're definitely still doing a tremendous amount of histology, especially in the next section of the class, when we do our cells and we do our tissues. That whole lab exam is probably 70% histology slides. So it's a massive amount of information. So making sure you understand that is important. The other thing you will find in our other sections here in the lab handouts is where you will find, and I hate to use the term study guide, but let's call it that, for the labs. So for instance, as I mentioned, there are whole classes that talk about histology. So when we get to our study of histology, I'm going to give you a histology handout that is going to have a place for you to draw the histology information. And there will be a list of information you are going to be responsible for. So there may be 5 things about this one particular tissue. Does that mean that this tissue only has 5 things about it? No, it just means that I'm only holding you for 5 things on this. Or When we get, for instance, to the bones, every single bone in your body, 206 bones in your body, you are going to be responsible for identifying. If it is a paired bone, you need to know whether it's the left bone or the right bone. But every single bone in your body also has characteristics to it, things we call bone features. Are you going to have to need to know every single bone feature about every single bone? No, I will give you a specific list. For one bone, you may just need to know one bone feature. For another bone, it may be 2 or 3. For another bone, it may be 6. For another bone, it may be 0. There may be some bones where you don't need to know any bone features. Does that mean that bone doesn't have any bone features? No, it just means that you're not responsible for it on the exam. So I will give you a precise list of the information you are responsible for on the lab exams to help you to focus that information.
Professor,
Yes.
when should we expect to see this handout?
When the module is released. So notice you don't see any lab for this section. Why not? Because I'm not filtering the information. You need to know all the regional terms. So since I'm not filtering the information, and you already have that information in your textbook, in your lab manual, on your PAL CD, and everything else, why should I have to recreate it? When we get to the cells, you need to know all of the anatomy of the cells. So why should I have to give you a list of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum, and nucleus when you need to know all of them? So there's no point in me making a study guide for this section, because when we're talking about these concepts, you need to know all of them. When I'm going to filter that information, when I'm limiting how much you need to know, then I will give you a precise list. But it's not my goal to recreate the information. This is also why I don't give study guides for lecture. You are responsible for everything we talk about in lecture. I have done study guides in the past. And the problem is when you give students study guides, that's all they study. They don't pay attention to anything else we've talked about in the class. All they do is look at the study guide. And so what that means is I have to put every single thing we've talked about in the class on that study guide. Because if I have a question on the exam that wasn't on the study guide, everybody's angry, everybody's up in arms. And so at that point, I'm just recreating my lectures. Now, what I would say is that your study guide for the lectures are the lecture handouts. The important thing to remember about these lecture handouts is they are outlines. Notice it's not my script. Those slides are not filled with every single word that comes out of my mouth. And you are not responsible for just what's on the slides. You're responsible for everything we talk about. But that outline is there in lectures. If there is a concept that we don't talk about in class, you don't have a homework assignment on, we don't cover in any other way, you're not responsible for it. If you look, we've covered a lot of material in this class already. However, if you go back to your chemistry chapter, you'll see there's a whole lot more in there that we didn't talk about. And all that stuff we didn't talk about, you're not responsible for on the exam. Now, I will warn you, there may be some slight, the only change to that might be, and it'll come up in the next section. Our next section tends to run a little long. So when we get done with skin, at the end of that lecture, I may not have an opportunity to talk about burns. So I may warn you, hey, we've ran out of time today. The test is in 2 days. I don't have a chance to talk about burns. Make sure you read about burns in your textbook because it's going to be on the exam. Notice we didn't cover it in class, but I specifically told you it was going to be on the exam. But if we don't talk about burns, and I don't tell you to cover burns, and none of your homework assignments involve burns, then burns not going to be on the exam. As I said, one of the things I love about this class is hard. I don't have to be tricky. You should be able to look at a class like today, any of our lectures, and at the end of the lecture, you should be able to come up with easily a half dozen possible essay questions. Right, look at today's. We spent talking about homeostasis, the components of homeostasis. We talked about positive and negative feedback. We talked about homeostatic imbalances. We talked about the 4 types of macromolecules. We talked about the structural organization of proteins. We talked about enzymes. Any of these things that are lists, any of these things that are processes, all of those things are things that make great essay questions. And so being the smart, sophisticated students that you are, you should be able to look back at the lecture outlines, look back at your notes, and you should start be able to peel out information you think that could easily be essay questions on the exam. And the awesome thing about that is if you do that, you can start practicing. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for people. There are 2 skills you need to have to be successful in a class like this. The first is you need to be able to put massive amounts of information into your brain. But the second is you have to express that information on the exam. Taking a test is a skill. Just like shooting a basketball is a skill. And not everybody is equally adept at shooting a basketball. But can everybody spend time practicing it and getting better? Yeah, absolutely. And that's what you should do. If after today's lecture, you think the 4 levels of the structural organization of proteins makes a good essay question, and I'll tell you it does make a good essay question, and I'm fairly certain that it's in the test bank and might show up on your exam, then what you can do is say, all right, if I was asked to describe that as an essay question, how would I write that out? And practice. Write a practice answer to that. I know you guys were talking about a Discord group. You guys could discuss it on there, discuss it with each other. You could email it to me and I'll grade it for you and tell you what was right and what was wrong and what could be improved and what you missed out on. All right? Practice these essay questions. The information that's going to be on the exams should be straightforward. Like I said, the concepts themselves aren't hard. It's just a lot of information. That's what makes this class hard. So the more familiar, the more comfortable with this information, the better you're going to be at it. Great question. So we didn't talk about that last one. So let's talk about this here. For the lecture exams, again, on average, it varies from exam to exam. I would say somewhere between 25 and 35 multiple choice questions. Somewhere between 2 and 6 fill in the blank questions. Those are more like vocabulary, short terms, things along those lines, alphabet soup words that you have to spell. And then usually somewhere, I would say between 7 and 9 essay questions. And again, with these essay questions, what I care about is the information, not the format. As I talked about, the essay questions don't have to be perfect paragraphs. You are welcome to use bullet points if you want. Now, the one caveat I will give you is sometimes when people use bullet points, they tend to be more brief in their description, and don't be brief. I want information. I want details. Usually when I'm grading these by hand, I go through 2 red pens on the first series of exams, writing and, writing describe, writing explain. And a lot of that has to do with my teaching style. I see my job as a teacher to be a tour guide. All right. If you go to Paris for the weekend, because after all, you don't have to be back to class till Monday, perfect time to go to Paris. If you go to Paris for the weekend, do you start in the upper right-hand corner of Paris and just go street by street through the entire city of Paris till you get to the other end? This is the part where you say no. No, excellent. No, instead you find a good tour guide. And that tour guide takes you not to the whole city, but to the 10 most interesting, most important locations. And that's my job. My job is to take the 20 concepts that are in chapter 1 and distill them down to the 12 most important. And the 12 most important are the ones that we talk about. However, if I'm limiting how much information you need to know, then I am expecting mastery of that information. I want depth, I want details, I want descriptions. Be specific, right? We were talking about that earlier when we were looking, oh, now that was the other class. We were looking at, we were in the other class, we were doing the cardiovascular system in 431. I showed them a histology slide of the heart muscle. And I said, one of the questions they could have on the exam is to identify the tissue type. And someone said muscle. Muscle is correct, but isn't cardiac muscle a much more specific, much more descriptive answer? Yeah. And so which one's going to get you more points? Just saying muscle or being specific and saying cardiac muscle?
Being specific.
Yeah, being specific, absolutely. Now I saw there were a couple questions. Let me go back and take a look at this. Yes, all exams are timed. Both the lab and the lecture exams are timed. So again, and it depends on the number of questions. On average, I would say a lecture exams have somewhere between 2 and maybe 2.5 hours of time. Again, that doesn't mean you need to use all of that time, but that is the time that is available for you. Lab exams are a teeny bit trickier. Lab exams, well, hold on, one other thing that I should say about the lecture exam. With the lecture exam, all the questions are provided at the same time. So if there's 50 questions on the exam, all told, all 50 questions will be there all together, and you can answer them in any order that you want. The lab exam used to be like that as well. The problem with the lab exams is I don't know what Zoom has done or Proctorio has done, but the problem now is that when I do, because it's again, all going to be images, probably somewhere I would say between 60 and 90 images. So 60 to 90 questions, one question per image. For some people, their internet speed and things like that are slow enough where, we'll get to that, where they weren't all loading at once. A lot of people are having problems getting kicked off. So with the lab exam, you will be presented the questions one at a time. Now you can go back. So if you get to question 15 and you after seeing question 15, you realize you answered question 3 wrong, you can click to go back to question 3. You can click and do that, but it will present them one at a time.
How long do we have for the lab exam?
The lab exams typically are, they are 1 minute per question, plus usually somewhere around 15 minutes for additional time or also for, you know, because it takes time to do the scanning of the area and all of that as well. So usually somewhere around 15 or 20 minutes of additional time for processing time, for Proctorio time, for all of that kind of stuff. So again, on average, these are usually somewhere between probably 60 and 90 minutes, somewhere around that range. They are 2 separate exams. So you can take them in either order that you want. But as I mentioned, people tend to have more problems with the graphic laden lab exams. So I strongly encourage you to start with the lab exams first. You're not required. If you really want to do the lecture stuff first, you can do that. But most people who have problems on the lab exam. And since these need to be completed during class time, you don't want to start your lab exam at 11 o'clock, having 90 minutes for the class, and then spend the first 15 minutes dealing with issues. Because at 12:35, the exam's shut down. So if you wait to the last minute to take the exam, you run the risk of running into technical problems, and those technical problems are not an excuse for an extension.
I have a question.
Yep.
So if we have technical problems, what would you like us to do? Like, because obviously we can't like pull our phone out and email you. So
the first thing, if you have technical problems, in the Proctorio, there is a Proctorio chat button that you can click that you can bring up Proctorio support, and they can help you with that situation. If something happens and it freezes on you, or you get kicked out, right? If you get kicked out, then you should, as long as you still have time remaining, you can log back in. If it freezes and 5 minutes have gone by and nothing's changed, then exit the quiz and go back into it again. You have the ability to re-enter, but I warn you that the timer keeps going. So if it freezes for you, don't sit there for an hour waiting to see what happens. Once you hit 5 or 10 minutes, if nothing has changed, if the Proctorio help can't help you, then try to kick out of the exam and start it again, because your timer is running. All right. Again, this should be nobody's first semester taking online classes. And unfortunately, I appreciate that disparity can be an issue, but if you're going to take an online class, there is the expectation that you have the hardware, you have the software, you have the reliable internet connection to be able to successfully complete this class. And unfortunately, those are things that are requirements for this class. Now, the last thing that I would say is that because as of right now, campus will be partially open, I believe it is possible either with DSPS or in the computer labs to be able to go and take a proctored exam online there. You would have to check with the computer lab to make sure that it is okay, but I believe that that would be something that would be possible. So if you have really bad internet, or if your internet were, is going down next week or something like that, then I believe that that is an option, but that is something you definitely need to talk to the computer lab about. But if you have problems, the first place you go is Proctorio support. I can't really do anything to change it. Once you're taking the exam, I don't have that control. Proctorio is the one that has that control. So they're the person that you can talk to. If you get kicked out and you can't get back in or something like that, that's when you would email me. But I, for the most part, don't have any control over the Proctorio. Now, to answer Savannah's question, again, as I mentioned, not only do I have to grade the exams, but I also have to review the videos and everything that goes along with that. My goal is always to get the exams graded within 1 week. If you have a Wednesday exam, then I will try to get them back by Monday. But because of all the other logistic things, like with the Proctorio that I have to deal with, it's not always possible to have it done in a week. But usually, if not a week, then usually by the next class after that. So usually 7 to 9 days. Yes.
For the lab exam, so that basically consists of like naming the bones, the regional anatomy, all that stuff.
Yeah, and as I mentioned on Wednesday, where is it? Yeah, Wednesday the 1st, we'll actually have a practice lab exam. That practice lab exam is made up of 20 questions that I've used on lab exams before. Some of the questions on it will actually be in your real exam as well. And so that you will actually not only be able to gauge how your studying is going, but you will be able to specifically see what the lab exam is going to be like. Like I said, most people have answered an essay question, a multiple choice question, a fill in a blank question. People know what to expect from those. I appreciate that a lab like exam like this is something new. And that is exactly why we're going to do the practice one on Wednesday the 1st. So again, that's not something that's an assignment you're doing beforehand. It's something we will actually do in class, talk about in class. You will take it in class, and then we'll meet together again to go over it. And again, it's not graded. It's merely a chance for you to see what to expect, to make sure that Proctorio is working properly. And like I said, it's a great opportunity to gauge how your studying's going, because the first exam is going to be on the 13th. So that gives you almost 2 weeks, where if you do really poorly on the practice exam, you can realize you're not studying this material the right way, and you can modify the way you're attacking the material to be able to be prepared for the real exam. Angie, did you have a question?
Yes. Okay. So you said the lecture and the lab are done one right after the other. How do you switch from doing the lecture to the lab, or the lab and then to the lecture exam?
There are 2 different quizzes. They're 2 different. So when you go to the quizzes, there will be 2 different assignments there. So you will see a lecture exam and you'll see a lab exam. And so you click it and you take it, and then you'll click it and you take it. So they're completely different. They're completely different tests. They're completely different grades, but obviously they're covering the same material, right? Because all the material and that's actually a great point. All the material we cover in this class, you are responsible for on all of the exams. Because really, lecture and lab are just different ways of learning the material. Yes, essay questions lead themselves more to describing process. Lab exams more for identification. But when we get to the Golgi apparatus, and I point to the Golgi apparatus on a lab exam, I could certainly ask you to identify it, and you say it's the Golgi apparatus. But could I also ask you what its function is? Yeah, absolutely. All right. And so, yes, all the information we cover in this class, you're responsible for on both exams. And that's also kind of why we have both exams on the same day, because it's all the same material. The other reason I have both tests on the same day is because if you split it up, all you do is waste an extra day. From previous experience, if I try to lecture first and then give you an exam, nobody's coming to lecture, or at least nobody's paying attention, because they're all studying for the exam. And if I try to lecture to people after an exam, they're brain dead and not paying any attention anyway. So it just, because it's all the same information, it makes more sense to just have one day where we're doing the test. That's all we're doing on those days. So on those days, if everything goes well, you'll never hear from me and I'll never hear from you. You'll take the tests, it'll go successfully, and then you can go drink heavily until our next class. All right. Aubrey, did you have another question?
Yeah, I was going to ask what you had said, but they're always on the same day. And then you said, to clarify, people take the lab exam first to make sure that it works. So you are not required to take the lab exam first. Again, there's 2 different tests and you can take them in any order that you want. And again, if you're a professional gamer and you know you just have an awesome system and it's going to run it just fine, and you really want to take the lecture exam first, then that's fine. But from previous experience, I would say 90% of the problems that students have on the exams involve the lab exams because of the large images involved in it. So they have problems with it downloading, or things freezing, or because they're not close enough to their modem, their loading speed slow things down. So most of the problems that I found people have it in the lab exam. And so because time matters, what I encourage you to do, you're not required, but what I encourage you to do to be most successful is when the exam opens at 8, start as close to 8 as you can and do the lab exam first. That way you have plenty of time to work out all those kinks. And the good news is, if there's no kinks and you breeze through it without any problem, then you get to take an extra long break before you take your lecture exam, right? Whereas if there are problems, then you just know you're going to get a shorter break, but still be able to take the lecture exam in time. Again, notice I said you have 2 to 2.5 hours to complete the lecture exam, but remember, the exams must be completed during class time.
So if you start the lecture exam at 12:15, you're only getting 20 minutes to complete that lecture exam. Right? It's not, you don't have to start it before class ends. You must complete it before class ends. So if you wait till 11 to start that lecture exam, you're only getting an hour and 35 minutes. Honestly, an hour and 35 minutes is probably enough time for most people. Some people like to take a little bit more time. I give that extra time because I'm trying to not have time be an issue. The lecture exam should not take you as long as the time that I give you, but some people like a little bit more time to luxuriate, to really stress over the questions, and I want to give those people that opportunity. But it shouldn't take you that long, but plan for it in case you need it, especially for the first exam. Once you take the first exam, you'll know what to expect on the next ones, and you'll have a better sense of whether you need more time or less time for that exam. Yes, Savannah.
So just to clarify, we won't have to come to the Zoom meeting on the exam days, so we won't have to check in. There won't be an attendance quiz. We'll just go right into the exam.
Correct.
Okay.
If you look at the schedule, it shows that there's a lecture on that day. But that's just because that when I set up the lectures, I said every Monday and Wednesday from 8 to 12:35 until December 15th. Right. So I didn't bother to go back in and remove the ones for the days that were not there. So, but yes, on exam days, all you're doing is taking the exams. Like I said, if everything goes well, there's no reason for you to contact me, and there's no reason for me to contact you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All righty. Excellent. Hopefully that helps to give you an understanding of what's going to be expected of you and what's going to be going on. We talked a little bit about the materials you're responsible for, the exams, the outlines, all of that kind of stuff. So those are the things that I wanted to cover. So any other questions on this or anything else that we have covered for today? All right, so then here is the game plan. That is all I want to cover for today. So we are done for today. We'll go ahead and finish a little bit early. Let's go ahead. Again, I'm going to need to, if you want to take, oh, I deleted already. Again, hopefully the 4 people that I said were being added sent me an email with their student ID. Did those 4 people all hear that? Hopefully they're still here. If you are on the wait list and I didn't list your name, then feel free to send me a direct message. I'll take a quick 15-minute break, go get some lunch, take a biological break, get some more caffeine, and then I'll be back in my Zoom office at about noon 15. That'll give us an opportunity for anybody who still needs to do their 5 for 5s can come and do that, and we'll get those done and get those out of the way. All right, so we can get that started a little bit early. Any questions on any of that? All right, excellent. Then you guys have a great day. Study hard this weekend, and I will see you on Monday.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good one.
You guys too. Bye.